January
Flashback.
2018. If you please all rise for a pledge of allegiance, followed by an invocation by Chaplain Meade. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Shall we pray? Father, we thank you for gathering us here, having a big crowd to study the solvency of this great city of Atwater. Father, we know that financial issues are always hot subjects, Father. We know that there's going to be many contested issues, many things that may come up that will bring about disagreement. But we ask, Father, that you'll help us to disagree in a way that is civil, way that will help to come to a final conclusion and make this city the great city that it can be. We thank you for everyone that gathers here and for the leadership here, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Roll call, please.
Creighton? Here. Raymond?
Here.
Vieira?
Here.
Vineyard?
Present.
Price?
Here.
We have a quorum. We would ask, before we get to comments from the public, that everybody would silence their cell phones, please. Make sure that your cell phones are silenced. Comments from the public. At this time, any person may comment on any item which is not on the agenda. Please state your name and address for the record. Action will not be taken on an item that is not on the agenda. If it requires action, it will be referred to staff and/or placed on a future agenda. To comment on an item that is on the agenda, please wait until the item is read for consideration. Please limit comments to a maximum of 5 minutes.
Are there any members of the audience that wish to make any comments from the public at this time? Seeing none?
We're moving to our next order, which is to study this study session regarding the City of Atwater organizational restructure project, positioning the city for financial solvency, phase 2 of 2. And I would mention to the public, just so everybody kind of is clear, that during the PowerPoint, it will be appropriate for the council to be interactive throughout the PowerPoint. However, for the public, we're going to ask that you would hold your comments or your questions until after the PowerPoint. Then that would be the appropriate time.
Okay. And with that, turn it over to Art to work.
Thank you, Mayor, and council members, and everyone in the audience. I'm not going to stand up here for the entire presentation. This is just to get us rolling, and it's like a little blood circulating. I'd like to start with introductions. Just state your name and your responsibility.
Don, the Regional Public Works Director. Mark Credo, Chief Building Official.
Janet Del Real, Human Resources Director. Lori Waterman, Deputy City Manager.
Doug White, Interim City Attorney.
Cindy Vieira, Council Member.
Brian Raymond, City Council.
Don Heiler, City Clerk.
Jim Price, Mayor.
Paul Creighton, City Council.
James Vineyard, Mayor Pro Tem.
Manish Varian, Church Chief.
Lakwinder Deal, Deputy City Manager / Finance Director.
Sandy Ron, Recreation Supervisor. Kendall Flint with Regional Government Services, and I'm a strategic planning consultant.
And she's not a private consultant.
I'm a public agency.
Lisa Rasmussen, Interim Deputy City Clerk.
Julie Krebs, Administrative Analyst.
Jim Sanders, Videographer.
Hey!
Well, I'd like to start by acknowledging how important the invocation was. And I say that because we are dealing with an extremely difficult situation. Frankly, I don't think we as mere mortals have the capacity within ourselves to solve this problem entirely. So we definitely need some major support. We are dealing with a critical situation. And all I can say is it's good that you're all here. We need additional support, and thank you very much.
Can you hear him? Okay, good.
Keep in mind that there is no speakers, this is all for audio.
My voice will carry.
Be loud.
Okay, what I've got here are two reports, and the council members are not loud enough?
Yeah, you be a little louder, please.
Okay, what I have are two reports. They date back to, I think, 2012, and they represent staff's and council's efforts in the past to deal with this financial problem that's been going on, I think, since 2008. And I'm not in any way criticizing these documents or the efforts that were put into trying to address those financial issues, but from what the best I can tell is that the efforts that were expended in connection with these documents got us through year by year. The long-term problem was not solved. If it were, we wouldn't be here in this, with this level of formality and with this level of intensity. The difference between this and what we're doing today is that we've got a 4-year focus, and I'm also inclined to look at these two reports as strike one, strike two, we have a strike three pending. If we do not answer the issues, we have to solve these problems. With the reason we're looking at a 4-year context is on the 4th year is when we get slammed by CalPERS with a very substantial financial hit. We can't wait really even a few more months to start addressing that so we can be prepared for each of those years that are forthcoming. Because by the time 2022 rolls around, if we don't have the cuts already being made and the revenues being raised, we will not make it through 2022. Now, the staff and I have literally been buried in the research associated with the report that we're going to go through today. And I do want to point out that it's important that they're all here, and I also want to assure you that we should be able to answer every question that you have. And that's because our effort in preparing for this was to identify every single financial threat that has or hasn't been talked about already, to get guidance from the council on what they want us to pursue, and then for us to develop an implementation plan. So with as much research as has been done, I'm very confident that we have the answers today. And I was going to ask you to make a couple of comments.
Sure. Thank you. It's never fun to sit around a table and try to figure out how to dig out of a hole. And it's always a challenge, and it's going to be a spirited discussion. Regional Government Services, my agency, is actually a joint powers authority. We are other cities in California that work exclusively with other cities and counties on projects like this. And frankly, one of the real issues here is that, as you know, in California, of our 600-something cities, about a third of them right now are in a similar situation. Everybody's in the situation as it pertains to PERS. And the interesting thing right now is that you guys are at what we would call a crossroads of time, where you really have an opportunity to make some changes that could have long-term benefits for the city and really right the ship to move it forward. So although there's a lot of negativity, and certainly I think staff, we've watched this before, staff has gone through a period of years where there have been cuts, there have been furloughs, there have been all these things, and we're still not there. So as I say, we've worked very closely with all the members of the staff in every single department at all levels to help put this information together. But I think what's important to recognize is that what we're doing today is reviewing a toolkit, a toolbox of all these different options that may or may not be a good fit for this council. You may support them, you may not support them. But our goal here was to present as many options as possible to get you to the point where you need to be in order to be solvent. If we don't take steps to make these things happen, you're going to be upside down, and as we'll talk about a little bit later, bankruptcy is not an option. I don't think anybody wants to see the city disincorporated because it's a beautiful community. You have people who have been here for decades, years and years. It's a great place. We need to get it back on track. So anything we can do today to be helpful in that, that's what we're trying to do. None member of staff took their own department as a off limits, every single department was looked at for possible savings and possible alternative service deliveries. So I think that's something that really needs to be applauded as well, especially when you have a group of folks that haven't seen a cost of living increase since 8 years ago. So even with all that, these folks are here at the table to make it work. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and hopefully we can come to some good resolutions.
So two more things before I sit down and we start rolling through the PowerPoint. I was going to ask the council politely for each of the slides, if you could let staff make its initial comments and then do whatever you want to do in terms of asking questions or making suggestions. But we pretty much have every slide choreographed among us, so we know who's going to say what. And I think you'll find that we'll have greater efficiency and get through this process more quickly. We've got it set aside from 2 to 5. I have a distinct feeling that we will use all of that time. In fact, we did a dry run earlier today, and it took, 2.5 hours just for the dry run. So in the interest of, getting this thing done, the last thing I want is to walk out of this room, and I'm sure all of you feel the same way. We don't want to walk out of here not knowing what specific direction we're going in. We've got to have those answers. So, and the last thing I want to do is, I've already made reference to staff, but I have to tell you that they have been here on their days off. Almost every evening they're working. And that was the case, I think, before we started into this project, but it became even more poignant. The workload has been incredible, and I'm surprised more of them didn't get sick throughout this process, because there's a lot of stress. Not only were they doing the work, but they're absorbing the blows. They know it's going to affect them personally, affect staff, it's going to affect the community. So we didn't take it in any, we didn't take it lightly. So I'm going to sit down and we'll start with the PowerPoint.
So the first setup here is really the purpose of the workshop, and this is a very specific piece here. What we're really here to do is basically help council identify those future expenditures that are coming up that you may or may not know about. We just want to make sure that you and the public do. We want to take a look at all the various service delivery options that we have and the way that that's happening, and determining if there are ways that we can be either more efficient, more cost-effective, or potentially eliminate a service that may not be critical to staff operations. And then, of course, we're also looking at potential revenue options, the ways that we can bring more funds into the city. I can tell you we are definitely going to be talking about fee recovery, master fee schedules, things like that, to make sure that the city is in fact recouping the cost of delivering a service regardless of what department it's in. And then finally, putting all those things together, hopefully today we'll get enough council direction in order to determine what we need to do or what we're going to have council support for to ensure the long-term fiscal health of the community. Fiscal status.
Yeah, I just want to say that in my view, now not everybody agrees with me, this to me is the most important slide of the entire presentation. And the reason is because you can see real-life case examples of communities that had significant failures. So throughout these slides, you'll see reference to Maywood, because they really did take a big blow. And you can see the dots. So to the extent that on that upper column where it talks about the capacity to respond, ability to pay, revenue growth rate, ability to retire obligations, and projected fiscal outlook, of those 6 communities, you can see that they pretty much failed in the majority of categories. We are generally in that same realm as, say, for example, Monrovia. I mean, these are the case studies that we really have to pay attention to. We must avoid those calamities that are listed up at the top there.
I think it's important to note that it's not like we live in our own little glass bubble here. The California State Legislature has the Legislative Audit Committee, and they are empowered with looking at incorporated agencies throughout the state to determine whether or not they have long-term viability. If this group audits this city at this point, they're going to have a determination that this city is not fiscally solvent and is not well managed. And if that happens, that can have a negative influence on your bonding capability and, frankly, on your ability to continue as an incorporated agency. So we want to avoid this at all costs. And one of the reasons we're having these conversations now is because this potential audit could come up sooner rather than later, and if it does, it has negative impacts for the community. So by proactively identifying means to avoid that, we're really in a much better position in order to be moving forward successfully and survive that type of audit. The current general fund has some very specific challenges to it. LaQuinder, did you want to go through that? Where are you? Yeah. There you are.
Well, our general fund does have a deficit of $2.5 million. Then we do have an interfund loan from sewer to general fund and of course for water fund as well. So approximately 2.4 million increase we are expecting in CalPERS alone in next 4 fiscal years. So unfunded liability just for OPEB alone, which is other post-employment benefits, that increased up to $7.7 million over these years. So.
And I think it's important to note that these are the short-term liabilities. This does not include the larger nut of CalPERS unfunded liability, which is about $30 million, I think, at this point. Is that correct?
That's right.
And again, not unusual for other communities. So frankly, I don't want you to get too much heart failure over that. At this point, we need to focus on the next 4 to 5 years and what is before us right now. And that brings us to what we have to do to be solvent in order to move forward.
So one thing I told the staff was I wasn't going to read slides to people to insult your intelligence. You can see the figures there. They are substantial and difficult.
Well, they are doable. I guess that's the thing. $1 million is a lot of money unless you hit the lottery today. And if anybody does, please let us know. We'd be more than happy to take that ticket off your hands. But $1 million a year, $844,000 in set aside. That's money that's set aside to deal with the current pay down of debt. And then we have to see an increase of revenue from whatever source we can come up with for 225. That package of consistent change over a 4 to 5 year period allows us to retire debt and be able to be moving forward more effectively. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, bankruptcy is not an option for the city because we have no dischargeable debt. Doug, did you want to just address that ever so briefly? I think, yeah, we can't do it. There's no option. 7-11 applies to people, and a 9 doesn't apply to us, which means that if we don't survive, basically, we just disincorporate. Future expense considerations?
Go ahead.
Okay. So you mentioned previously, CalPERS liabilities are going to continue to increase. The reason for this is because CalPERS has changed the way that it does its math. It used to be that they had a higher percentage that they were contributing based on revenues from their investments. Those investments have gone down substantially, which means now they're shifting that burden back to the cities. In some cases, and I know CAL FIRE was one of them, they've individually increased their contributions, but however you slice it, it means there are more contributions for any agency that's in CalPERS, and this is what we're looking at for the next 4 years. Additionally, CAL FIRE statewide has a 5% cost of living increase that happens every year moving forward. As I think you mentioned earlier, the staff has not seen a cost of living increase since 8 years ago. And for every even 1%, that has a general fund impact, about $100,000, another maybe $50,000, $47,000 for the other types of funds. Whether or not that's something that happens first year, second year, third year, something to keep in mind is it's very difficult to retain or attract employees if you cannot pay them. And so essentially with that much time of not being righted, they've been losing money and they're upside down. So their other people in other communities are actually moving along and they are not. So it is something you have to consider. Council has also expressed a desire to eliminate furlough. If you do that, that's approximately $153,000 a year, which means we have to make that up someplace else in order to offset that piece. Just so you know, things we're talking about today, there's implementation costs, and there's also some things we're going to talk about later about Measure H. Implementation costs would be for those projects, programs, or service delivery methods that we transition to something else. There will certainly be costs in doing that, and whether that is legal review of existing contracts or restructuring things, or the use of consultants to either transition or train others to get into other spots, these will all be there. We're also going to talk about Measure H, which is the half-cent sales tax for public safety, and should that be something you want to continue, we're definitely going to have to look at some polling and some other ways to get a consultant in to take a look at is that something that local voters here at Atwater will support? And then we have these two sections that I just want to kind of briefly go over. First of all, the next series of slides are all about show me the money. The first section is really about things we're looking for council direction. These are things that staff and the city manager's office have identified as possible, both revenues generating and or savings, and we will need your direction to determine whether or not those are something you want us to pursue. The second set are things that staff are already engaged in, and so in some cases have already happened in their efforts to move things along. So you want to
Yeah, go ahead.
go from the top? Huh?
I'll handle this
Okay,
one.
yep.
So this is one of the relatively big ticket items that could save up to $316,000. The one thing I want to point out to the council is that it's likely not to be the actual 316 because we'd have to find some creative ways to provide the battalion chief backup, perhaps with the county itself. But it's definitely a starting point. We think that it's doable, and if you look at that $1 million figure, it makes a significant dent. And this, by the way, was an add-on to CAL FIRE's budget, I think, about
2015,
2015, yeah.
basically 1.5 positions.
Right. Doug, you might want to comment to the extent that there are things to say about it.
I think as it relates to the city attorney, I don't see the workload going down and in fact, I see it going up, but there'll be about a $55 savings per hour, and most of the services are being rendered, as well as you're not paying for travel time anymore. So you may wind up paying the same amount of money, but you'll get a lot more services within the context of that money. So one of the challenges with the city attorney budget is you've been budgeting at a certain number that's been sub 200, and you've never been sub 200 in the last 4 or 5 years. So that's one of the challenges, because what's happening is you're getting budgeted numbers, but by the time the fiscal year going, by the time you hit month 4, month 5, you're already at or exceeding your budget, which is why I think you've heard certain things in the past of like, okay, we're going to go in the black, and this is how we're going to go in the black, but it hasn't translated or opening it, it hasn't translated to the end of the year, and you wind up having to do budget amendments that completely destroy the premise upon which the budget you voted on initially at the beginning of the year was based on. So there's a lot of reasons for that, but me looking at it, just coming in and trying to figure out where we're at, I can just use the legal budget as an example. You're probably around 500 this year. You budget 165. That's a big difference. So.
Okay,
Go ahead, next slide.
City manager.
I have a question.
Yes.
I know that we can be interactive through this, but we don't have our
Of
buttons.
course.
What do you want us to do?
Just,
Talk?
yeah, sure.
Okay. Let me go back to slide 4. Here, well, it's page 4 for us, where I was talking about CAL FIRE.
Oh, yep.
I think it was 2 meetings ago that Jim had asked for a study to see the cost difference between utilizing CAL FIRE and going back to a city maintain. Has that started? Do we know where to get that from, or what is the difference? How much savings did we have when we moved from a city CAL FIRE department to CAL FIRE? What was our savings?
Yeah, we don't have the figure. I imagine that the cost might have actually gone up back then, but I don't know for sure. But this is one of those things that was such a big, significant policy issue that staff did not start a process of reviewing this. Now, contrary to that, the dispatch center is something that we're fully engaged in looking at cost, the alternative to us providing that service going with the county. And I think, and you'll see a slide come up that deals with that, but we're communicating very seriously with the county, and we're actually, I think in May is when we're going to find out what their proposal is. So.
When a couple of months ago, when John Bramble was here, we had asked him for a survey to address or a study to address or at least I spoke to him about it, the dispatch center and some different services, and he told us that it would actually, that they had done the study in Merced, and it would actually cost more, but I never saw any. Have you seen any of that documentation, or did you guys see it? No?
No, as far as I can tell, there wasn't a study done. Maybe somebody in CAL FIRE can mention, but
Okay.
I don't think that was done, so.
Okay.
But I think if I might, to your point, regarding CAL FIRE versus having a standalone department, it would be possible for us to get you numbers for similar sized jurisdictions, because that we really want to look at. I'm not discouraging you from getting studies, because they can be very valuable, but they can also be very costly. And for the number of people that you have in this community, from the people that we've worked with, you see more oftentimes people going to CAL FIRE or going to a community facilities district, a community service district or some other mechanism, because frankly, the overtime and the investment in equipment is far too expensive for a jurisdiction of this size to be able to maintain. And I think the thing that might be a better look for you is to look at similar jurisdictions, same size, same population distribution, because you're not going to compare to some of this rural, but where you've got that, and we could get that information for you relatively quickly without having to go too far into it.
Yeah, so one thing I didn't make clear when I was standing up there was it's staff's hope that on point-by-point basis that council will give us direction. So for example, if you want that study, I mean, I got the sense that there was already a consensus about that, but we'd like to hear.
I think that there was a consensus, and Jim had asked for it over a month ago, and I think previously it had been requested as well, but I didn't know what was happening. And I think something simple of just saying, okay, let's look at another city your size with your equipment. This is what it cost them annually, because when I came into city council, CAL FIRE had already been there. They provide a superior service, but I have no idea what and I was assuming that we left the city fire to go with CAL FIRE because of a savings, but I had no idea what that savings or what that financial impact was.
And I think that's a really good point. In fact, we've worked on several where we've had both ways, where people want to go to CAL FIRE, come back from CAL FIRE. And what it really comes down to oftentimes is the equipment, the maintenance of the equipment. Like you have a truck that goes sideways, you as an individual have to figure out a way to replace that truck, right? Whereas CAL FIRE can get truck from another place. But I think we could get that information for you again quickly. That is not something that would take a lot of time.
There actually was a
Yeah.
one done back when City Manager Kively was here. However, it was done in the fact that there wasn't a direct comparison hour for hour. It was a little more 72 hours versus 56.
Sure.
My question is, what is it match for match?
Right.
Because that is the only way you can actually get a true account of it. The equipment is ours, so it's going to be more of a match for
Okay.
personnel. What's it going to cost for personnel? And that's going to affect CalPERS and everything else, because CAL FIRE basically, we're a pass-through.
Right.
So CAL FIRE picks up CalPERS. So that's really where it's going to end up. But that report is somewhere in this city.
We'll
from
we'll
my
find that.
understanding.
I
Well,
think one of the other reasons why CAL FIRE, the additional services that they brought to the table as well is the training and the additional services that they brought along with them.
Correct. And that all has to be inclusive of what we would pick up, because we're gonna have to pick up that training and everything else to elevate our own firefighters to the national level, the NFPA level, which is what CAL FIRE has to match.
And I would also point out,
or
there's
above. So,
There's nothing that would prevent council from
Correct.
saying, you know what, for the short term, we're good with this, but for the long term, we'd like to look, and you could be looking at, cooperative agreements with other municipalities where and I've seen that happen where, I'm not saying they're gonna do this, but let's say you decided to bond with Livingston or somebody else, that you form your own department, or you form your own. All those things can be done, but those are at least a year to a year and a half to implement, and your needs are shorter term than that.
correct.
well, for the record, we're going to assume, unless we're told otherwise, that you'd like us to move forward with some level of examination of the alternatives. And I think the best way to bring that back would be in the form of a study session, because it is a detailed process, so.
And my main purpose for bringing that forward is because people in the public have asked for that.
Sure.
There's been enough people that have said, why aren't we having our own fire department? What's it gonna cost? It's not so much they don't care for CAL FIRE, but they wanna know what it would cost for our own department. So let's bring that study forward and let the people see, are we benefiting or are we not? So,
So Lisa, you've got that? Okay, good.
Okay. Any other discussion on this particular item? Yes.
I just want to make note also, what Lori says is very important about the training level, because I remember back when Chief Banks and Chief Sparks were our fire chiefs, that was one of their main concerns, was continuing education and training levels. And then fast forwarding to now, were we to go to our own department, we're talking about having to have 19 full-time firefighters. So 19 more CalPERS obligations. And that does, the one plus with CAL FIRE is that if somebody retires or gets sick, goes on vacation, whatever, they just backfill. You know, there's no scrambling to find somebody, where we may have those types of issues, you know, with our own employees. So it works out, and we don't pick up the overtime costs for them and that kind of thing. It's all into that one cost package. So I think the overall benefit so far is what we have.
Okay.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments on this particular slide?
Well, can we just confirm that we are going to move forward though with the study, so at least we have the information to make an informed decision?
Yes, and I think it's appropriate to also talk about hybrid versions where you have full-time and not necessarily volunteer staff, but reserve staff.
Okay.
But I think that's just what's needed to really present all the information you need to make a decision, and then staff carries it forward, so.
So moving forward, then we're going to just set up a study session to focus on this one item.
Yes, and I'm gonna ask Kendall what amount of time she thinks it would take to do that,
Well,
kind of a superficial level.
You see, I think if everybody's okay with it, I think we would be able to quickly come back to you with a one sheet that basically says, here's 10 jurisdictions of your size and like, and looking at the hourly rate cost to cost, that would be a simple thing to do. I think, this is just my 2 cents, and you can take it or leave it, but I think at this point with your financial status, to have a huge study being done is probably not a good use of your funds when you can get a one of these.
Yes.
And then based on that, if you feel like there's something that's there, then you can move on to the next step.
Perfect.
And if I would say, let's keep track of all these things, because frankly, I think there's gonna be more than one of them, and we can come back and perhaps tackle that and several other issues at a second session like this, where we can, you know, do them all at the same time and be efficient with your time.
Next slide. Next one.
We've got that.
So this one, I think I have a unique perspective on. First of all, I'll repeat what I said 2 nights ago, and that is there's been a lot of turnover in the city manager position. I'm of the mind that it may be difficult to attract city manager candidates who have a long-term view on the community, who would bring the kind of skill and experience that is needed at this time. But at the same time, after working in this position for 3 months, it looks to me like you can clearly get away from a full-time, fully benefited city manager. Now, when I speak about this, some of you may be thinking, oh, he's setting himself up for a part-time interim long-term. That is not the case. I'm not sure. Well, the way I look at my role, I'm probably, in my view, the right person at this particular time. But as we move into transition and implementation, you might need a different kind of city leader. So that's not my objective. My objective is to see if there are ways that we can cut costs. And it's clear to me that you don't need a full-time, fully benefited $246,000 a year city manager. And that was the whole point of getting the 2 deputy city managers in place, because they carry forward the institutional knowledge. They will have the responsibility for sticking with the workload and the projects that they've been assigned, and it won't fall between the cracks.
Just want to add to that, that is not an unusual arrangement for smaller cities. There are quite a few out there that have a city manager that works 2 days a week, 3 days a week. It just depends on the size of the jurisdiction. So you would not be doing something that is unusual or, you know, out there. It's not every day or common, but it is definitely more common than you would think.
And I will also want to point out that I think it's critical that whoever the city manager is, whether it's full-time, part-time, interim, it doesn't matter to me. It's gotta be in that person's contract that they are fully accountable for the continuation of implementing the things that the council directs us to do to save the city's financial health. And that's something that has not happened in the past. Every 2 weeks, there should be an update provided to the council until, I don't care if it's till 2030, whatever it takes. This is, the persons in these positions have to be held accountable with bi-weekly updates in a council meeting. There should be a little presentation about where are we at, what have we accomplished, what obstacles are we facing, and what do we do next. So I've heard rumors, I haven't been able to verify it, but that the topic of a part-time city manager has actually been discussed by one or more people who have been in these elected positions here. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I certainly think it's an important thing to consider. Next slide.
Before we do next slide, any council comments on that concept?
Actually, I do, because the audit report from Sacramento, if I remember correctly, or one of the reports from Sacramento said the biggest problem we've had is we've had constant interim city managers. We have not had a permanent city manager to stabilize this city. Now if we're gonna continue that trend, then we're gonna continue the trend of the destabilization. And even talking to a large portion of the employees, it's like they get set with one city manager and another one comes in. Even myself, I've said, each city manager, each boss, doesn't have to be a city manager, but each boss manages differently. Each boss sees things differently, and so when they come in, the focus changes. So even though we have this set and forth, you're gonna have one come in, the focus is gonna change. Now, each department head, each employee has to readjust to a new focus. So with a permanent city manager, you're gonna have him come in, he may readjust his focus, but at the same time, he now has everything to develop with. He has to fall in with everything. Instead of 6 months, he now has several years in which he can adapt to everything. So we just have to adapt to the fact that we have to reduce the amount we pay them to start with, depending on their knowledge.
It's an excellent point, and I'll tell you from experience, we went through 6 city managers in 5 years in Half Moon Bay, and it was a bloodbath. But there's nothing to say that the council could not have a city manager, non-interim, on a 24, 32-hour schedule. And that, you'd be surprised by how many people out there may be interested in that, and that kind of a concept. So that could be an alternative for you to consider. I think point being, at least that the suggestion is for now, it isn't necessarily, although everybody would love it to be a full-time, this is an area where you have potential savings. And whether you call it interim or you call it staff, it's the hours that are tied to all those things.
So I have a question for Art. You mentioned a couple slides back that with the 2 deputy city managers in this plan, that the intent of this plan is to impose this on any future city managers that may come, that they don't do like what Jim was saying, a different style, a different management technique. And we're trying to set a path of recovery, and they have a different skill set and they want to take it a different direction. What we're trying to do is set a path of recovery, no matter who comes in or what they do, they follow this plan, and that's what these 2 are supposed to do. And that's why they're going to be held accountable to do that for every 2 weeks. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, essentially, that was the whole purpose, and that's where I'm basing I've got the assumption that it's going to be difficult to find somebody who meets that kind of a design. I think the more likely candidate you're going to have are going to be retirees, and like Kendall was pointing out, there is a good chance that you could find a part-time person who's not drawing benefits, because that's what kills. That's why it's 200. With the current situation, it's $246K a year. It's $250,000. So, but I think what the council needs to tell us is what you'd like to do, and we can refine how the job description is written, and then you can make decisions. So you're going to have to make a decision here in the next 3 months anyway. But what we've done with the 2 deputy city managers is, to some extent, we mitigate the fallout, the negatives of what's been happening. And I fully agree about the transition and having different city managers in place. It makes the staff very nervous, and each manager brings a different style, so those are definitely negatives. I do think these two deputies can buffer a lot of those negatives, so. But
Can we, I know I talked a little bit with LaQuinder and a little bit with Lori. I mean, how comfortable do you guys feel with this? With really, if we bring in someone who's going to, looking at someone who would probably be retired, working 2 or 3 days a week to keep the costs down, not paying benefits. You girls are really gonna be, you know, driving that wagon. They're just gonna be there to mentor you and kind of keep you. I mean, how comfortable do you feel with that situation? Are you ready for the challenge?
We are.
It's a lot on your shoulders, you know?
I think they've dispersed the different duties to address that, and how it's dispersed now. I mean, hopefully, before a new city manager comes in, gives us a time or a chance to at least get acquainted to the new tasks that were assigned, and settle in and feel comfortable with that. And with a part-time that would still be available to address any issues that we had. I'm sure that they would be available even if they weren't here, but yes, we could.
Do you feel that if the positions we now have with you and LaQuinder were in place over the changes, over the last few years, do you think it would have gone smoother because you would have had someone there as a safety net?
I think, actually, Art's actually addressed that as well. It's the consistency of what we've got going on. One person knows, and I know, and it's not just this position, we've had that turnover in a lot of other positions, but you have 1 or 2 people that are responsible for new businesses or new projects that are coming. We have one person to address those issues, and so that consistency and continuity will carry through if the city manager position changes. So I think that will help.
So in order to look further into this and consider implementing this or just looking at it and seeing if it's wanting something, what do we have to do? Just say, yes, this is a part of the plan that we should look at. I see $100,000 potential savings. I think it would be even more if we're not paying CalPERS, if we're not paying medical benefits. So this is a tenth to a quarter of what we need. We have to cut $1 million.
yeah, well,
So,
this is one of those.
actually, we have to cut almost $2 million, because what we're proposing is, we have $1 million a year, we have to make up, that's how much we're, right now, living outside of our means, $1 million a year. So if it were my household, and I'm living outside of my means, $1,000 a year, and eventually, so that's going on my credit every month. My credit cards are gonna max out, I'm done. Eventually, we can't pay the lights, we can't keep the doors open. So even though it's not, this is not a perfect plan, we don't have a choice. We have to cut. It's not a perfect plan, but we're broke. We've kicked the can for so long, we don't have an option of waiting for a perfect plan.
Well, you asked if, what does the council specifically have to do? I mean, if you want to make more or less a philosophical commitment to doing this, then you could do that now, based on a majority, but although it can't be a decision per se, it's just direction. Right, Mr. Attorney?
That would be correct.
I think that the
But-
option would be to cut to, after this and the subsequent, basically, to then come up with the plan, a list of all the potential cuts that have been, I'm saying, get the nod from council, like, okay, this is one we can live with. Then we bring that before council for adoption. At that point, you would actually make a decision on it for the record, we'd move forward. I think what we're looking for today is if there's anything in these lists that are like, absolutely not, do not even consider that, don't do it. Or, yeah, that's something we can live with. We're not crazy about it, but we can live with it.
Gotcha.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Kendall. And, I mean, you can keep it as simple as just waiting until you have to, deal with the expiration of my contract. By then, you might know even more about how effective the options are being presented are actually going to cut back on the expenses for the city. But like I said, I'm the incumbent. I'm pretty sure I know what the duties are and what kind of pressures we're experiencing. And I have total confidence in these 2 deputy city managers to take care of business and even to maintain the organizational culture and to maintain the consistency. And one thing you'll hear about it at a later time, but I might as well give you a clue, is I've already started changing the reporting relationships so that a variable like me, the city manager, wouldn't have as much impact. So as an example, henceforth, I think we talked about starting next week, the people who are in Lori's area of responsibility will start meeting with her without me being present to basically overshadow whatever she's doing. So there's going to be this buffer between people like me who appear to be interlopers, and so you have that consistency and less of a shock. But when I came along, I know I was a big shock to the system with a very different style from what has been articulated in a lot of different ways, and not necessarily all good, but different. So I do think it'd be healthier for the employees not to have that constant, who's next and what kind of contortions are we going to have to go through. So my point is that buffer will make a big difference. I think it already is, frankly. So
Okay.
next slide.
Moving on, this is Community Services Recreation. This is a gut check, and it's unpleasant, so I just want to say that right up front. Currently, recreation services cost about $424,000 a year on revenue of $246, which means every year, recreation services are currently operating at a general fund loss of about $172,000. And the challenge here is that a lot of those services are being provided. These are programs, and I was here yesterday, signing up for soccer, all these things that are great. Not all the participants are Atwater residents. Some come from the county, some come from other communities, but you're gonna have to take a hard look at this and decide how you wanna move forward. There are several options in front of you. One, you can leave it, which basically means you're gonna continue to subsidize that through general fund, and I think we've made pretty clear you're already upside down in your general fund, so that is a real challenge. You can merge programs with county, school district, or other agencies. This has been a popular solution to several jurisdictions in California, specifically Santa Clara, Half Moon Bay, Grand Terrace, and what many of these folks have done is combine their recreation services with other agencies in order to handle the programming side. Your actual facilities like this, we're not talking about that, we're talking about the programming end of it, right? So you can go that route, or you can privatize it straight up, which means that the city of Atwater would no longer provide recreation services. They would allow outside agencies like Boys and Girls Clubs, church groups, depending on where you live, Pop Warner, Little League, all these other things that they would be responsible for getting the signups, fielding the teams, whatever that might be. This is a fundamental shift that's happening again throughout the state. Most communities, one of the things you first hear from their elected officials, and especially from members of the public, is that, hey, this is one of the things that it contributes directly to our quality of life. When we have these programs, it keeps kids off the streets. There's all these pluses to it. But again, at the end of the day, this is a service line that is not self-supporting, it is not self-sustaining. So one of the discussions we really need to have is sort of which direction council would like to see us move in order to solve this particular problem. And so that, we're really very interested in hearing what your comments are on that.
So is that a matter of not charging enough for the program?
Yeah,
or
it's a little bit of both. Unfortunately, and this is not unusual anywhere again, most places subsidize parks and recreation programming, especially for low-income or at-risk kids. So if you're an adult and you're playing, golf, whatever it might be, baseball, those are usually recovered costs. But a lot of these are soft costs that are not recoverable. And so at the end of the day, you wind up charging so much that it didn't quite make sense. In other instances, it can just be you've got too much overhead. It's really hard to pin on it what it could possibly be. But in the cases where they've outsourced it or brought it to someone else in the short term, doesn't mean you can't come back to it later. And I'll use Half Moon Bay again as the example. They initially closed their Parks and Recreation department, didn't have it anymore, and outsourced it all to Santa Clara. Santa Clara then did all the programs, so when they were printing their annual guides, all that, they just did both cities at the same time. That turned out to not be as efficient because there was too much geography in between, so they went to an arrangement with the Boys and Girls Club. That has turned out to be really very productive and very good. So Boys and Girls Club now runs that, and then as it became more successful, and the city got back on track, they started paying a subsidy to Boys and Girls Club to manage the programs.
Okay,
And
so
again,
outsourcing it then, did the city then get a percentage of that outsourcing? Because what you do is you lose everything. I mean, granted, we're behind the curveball
Right.
anyway, but you lose anything that's coming in
Well,
by outsourcing it all
you
together.
keep your fees for use of facilities, so
Okay.
you keep those, but you just don't deal with the programming side.
Okay.
So, you know, you'd still get ball fields, and you have a maintenance district, as an example, that pays for that, and that's fine.
That all stays the same.
Right, it's the soft side of the house, which unfortunately is the thing people participate in. But, we need some sort of direction about how you want to explore that, or if you even want to explore that at all.
So I
know
have,
it's-
I have a question on the $424,000 a year cost, and then we show a $172,000 a year operating loss. If we privatize, go back to the other slide. The 172 privatization of services results in savings. How?
Staff.
So if we were to do the option to consider there, explain that.
So if you no longer have a Parks and Recreation Department, then frankly, you have no Parks and Recreation staff. So if you don't have staff, you don't have PERS, you don't have benefits, you don't have all those things, because it's a service you are no longer providing.
So
if
what,
you're no-
what costs us the 240 that's left over from that 172 savings out of the 424?
That's the revenue side.
It's the revenue side of it. So that's what you're getting in terms of the cost that people pay to participate in the programs.
So how do you operate a program if you don't have staff though?
I'm sorry? Please.
I didn't
I'm
really
confused on that.
get into this, I wasn't asking any questions, but also included in.
So it's all
this
just
isn't
physical.
recreation, this is facility
Right.
rentals. I also have to mow parks and community center and open and close restrooms and this department, so that also includes those expenses, those costs, yeah.
Yeah.
No,
I just wanna make sure everybody's clear on that.
You're generating $250,000. It costs almost $500,000 to do, so that shortfall, how do we still generate the 246 if there's nobody here to do that? I don't understand.
The only
Yeah,
thing you get
please.
is revenue from facilities rentals.
So strictly, but where's that done at? That we just moved to City Hall? Who does that? Somebody's gotta rent it.
Yeah, that's what she's saying is.
It
the-
would go
This
through,
isn't rental revenue, it's either.
It'd be reallocated to a different department.
Those
Revenue for
duties.
rentals that's included in the cost, the revenue's not in there, is it?
yeah, so basically, let me put this another way. If this is an area that council wants us to explore further, much like the discussion on the CAL FIRE thing, what we would want to do is have a more elaborate assessment that says, this is specifically what you're getting in fee rentals, this is what you're paying in soft costs for the programs, this is what you're paying for staff, and this is the combination of those things that you consider. And at that point, we would have more information. The question we have today is like, is this an area you want to explore for potential cost
I think
savings?
so, but also the comments you said that
Yeah.
some people are from outside the community. So we're trying to provide what little services we have to our residents.
Right.
We're not trying to deny anybody in the county, but the county has programs. So look at those numbers also. How significant are those signups? And if you shrink the programs, do you get a net savings?
And that's another good question, because in other communities, again, where I have the merging programs, which is another possibility, I say, you can charge more money to participate in programs for non-residents if you chose to go that route. So, I mean, my suggestion, again, at the pleasure of the council, I think it'd be wise to take a look at both of these two options, working with county and privatization, and then have that be one of those things we come back with more information. I do believe there are savings to be had. I think that it's an area that you definitely need to address because it is losing, but I also recognize that there are some key, again, quality of life issues and expectations within the community to continue to have access to parks, because parks, that's why you have park and lieu fees, that's why you set aside the space.
Right.
So-
So, like, just a comparison, Merced, Livingston, Atwater.
Mm-hmm.
Say Livingston's running programs that's making them a lot of money. It's a really popular program in that community, but you try to duplicate that here, it doesn't work. Are we doing those things wrong? Are we trying to provide a program that isn't really targeting our people? And if you did, would those revenues go up quite a bit?
And I think that goes to option to consider if we talk about merging things. And again, I'm not saying that this is correct, we have to get further into it. But what if Livingston is like the football king and everybody wants to play basketball over here? You know, we need to decide or figure out, you're right, are there things that we do better and make money at and let them do the others? And I think that, you know, if council directs us to take a look at those, both combining and privatizing, personally, I think that would make the most sense.
Is there a way, Sandy, to break down what programs we're running, we're losing the most? So for instance, if we're doing soccer and we lost 50,000 in soccer, but we're breaking even in softball, maybe we could continue softball and get rid of soccer. So is there a way for the accounting of that? Or maybe that would be a LaQuinder question, I don't know.
It'd be the RGS.
Okay.
And when you look at the overall fees, because we did, there's for each one of the different sports, you can see a cost and a revenue. It is broken down, but you have to take into consideration all the other things, you know, the printing of programs, advertising, you know, staff, all these other things. But I definitely think it's worth looking more into, because, you know, with your concurrence, I mean, I think that would be a great thing to do. And I know she's totally willing and able to.
We have another question on the merging program. The mayor was just talking to me about, if we did a merging program, who on staff would manage that? And then what cost would that be? Would that be an additional cost? Are there costs with that?
It's too preliminary to say at this point, because as an example, and again, not saying this is how it'd be, but let's say we did something with Livingston, right? And what do we say? Do we go, okay, Livingston, you're gonna have one staff person on this, and Atwater's now gonna have one staff person on this? Or do we have a half one there and a 1.5 here? I don't know. We need to take a look and see what the requirements are, but it's the same kind of thing that actually LAFCO's looking at now. Anytime you can reduce admin costs and duplicated staff costs by combining services, it's a good thing. So that's something we should look at. You know, and maybe, you know, if we're doing a better job in terms of the facilitation, you know, it becomes something to Atwater and it can turn around as a revenue generator. I don't know, but I know that whatever we're doing,
Like
it's not making money.
regionalized programs and utilize the bus and other things to make an opportunity happen.
Right.
Okay.
And facility fees too, we would share.
Well, those are, I hear the questions
Yeah.
coming up.
Well, the
but
facility would stay. In other words, there's other, it's the software.
Just keep in mind also that one of our major objectives is to eliminate the unfunded liabilities associated with PERS. So while it looks like it's 172K here, which I'm pretty confident in, it's the long term that we're really concerned about, and that is to just
Would also like to
bring
point
down
out one other piece before I forget. Sorry, I know we were supposed to interrupt, but I couldn't help myself. One of the slides you're going to see later is an option for a utility tax. And a utility tax would be like the ideal if you wanted to have this thing completely funded, because it's a relatively small amount of money. It would still have to be approved by voters. But if your community really wants to see Parks and Recreation fully funded for forever, you know, a 1/4 cent, 1/2 cent utility tax might be a way to accomplish that. Just saying.
How would that be different than the one that we tried in the city several years ago, about 25, 30 years ago?
I'm guessing it wouldn't be different at all. The whole point of some of the taxes that pass and some that don't, we find that in the last 5, 10 years, those that are special taxes requiring the 2/3 majority, when you have it tied to a specific thing, tend to get a little bit more voter loyalty than those when you say, trust us, we're gonna take that money at 50% and we're gonna spend it the way we told you to spend it. And frankly, voters don't believe that. And we saw that in the polling for both Measure V and up in Stanislaus County for Measure L. Those two passed because of a very big education effort coupled by political action committees that pushed for it. Recreation programs, school programs, police, fire, these kind of special taxes do and can win. It just depends. You just can't leave it out there for, we're going to spend this just to make your community better. You would, in my opinion, you'd have to tie it to something.
Well, when we had it before, it was found to be an illegal tax and it had to be discontinued.
Is it a special tax?
I don't know if it was special.
Was it 20? You said 20 years ago?
About 25.
Mayor, I'd be happy to look at it and just report back on what it was.
Because there was the.
It's fine. I'll look at it and we'll figure it out.
Okay.
You know, I just want to point out that one thing that I thought might happen during the course of this meeting is that when this is right in your face and you're looking at cutting people and you're looking at the political ramifications of eliminating programs that are near and dear to the community, then it's like, well, is there other ways to save this? And I get that, and it's important. But I think when you get back to the spreadsheet, I don't think do you have that in the form of?
We have it in
Okay.
Flickwender's, but, you
When
know.
you see that spreadsheet, you'll see that you don't have many options. There's not much room for
Yeah.
doing a whole lot of rescuing.
This one?
Yeah, well, something's going to have to give. It's just a question of which combination of things give. But what I'm hearing from council right now is that reluctantly, there's a desire to explore either sharing services with other jurisdictions or straight privatization, and you'd like to see a comparison of what that might look like. Would that be an accurate?
Yes.
Okay.
And also with this discussion about a half-cent sales tax or quarter-cent, whatever it would be on a utility tax, that was a real go-go back when it happened.
It was a real, I'm sorry, I missed that. A real what?
It was- Never mind.
Did you say a GoPro? GoPro, oh.
In any case, it
A
was.
boondaggle.
It was that too. So, I mean, you know, you know, pushing for something like that is gonna be like pushing a proverbial rope uphill. It's gonna be extremely difficult, and, anyway, if Doug
Yeah.
is gonna come back with particulars on that, that's fine. But, the attitude for something along those lines, I think would be a very, very hard pill to swallow.
And I'd have to agree with you on that, which we'll
Non-starter.
definitely be
Yeah.
talking about that a little bit later.
I'm gonna tell you, as far as I'm concerned, yeah, we may only have very limited options, but if we limit ourselves to those options, then we fail. Because if there are other options out there to look at, and we do not do that,
You gotta look at everything.
we fail.
Yep.
Right, no, I agree.
agree.
We have to look at everything possible.
Yep.
That's right.
No,
We have to.
I agree, Jim.
and speaking of everything possible,
Nice segue.
apparently this is now not only possible, but legal in California. Did you want to take this one, or did you want me to?
No, I'll handle it. Marijuana?
Yeah.
I say yes.
Well, Doug's going to have to chime in on this in a moment, but here's the bottom line on the marijuana situation. And this is me editorializing, but I think it's my place to do this. If you're thinking that you're going to solve your long-term financial problems with marijuana-related ordinances, then I think it's very risky territory. There's a bell curve associated with this kind of revenue. It starts off with a bang, goes up fast, and then it comes down as other communities adopt these kinds of ordinances that permit the manufacturing and the dispensaries. And if you go into Washington State, for example, where I went to visit one of my sisters a while ago, they started out with just a few dispensaries. Pretty soon there was a whole bunch of them, and the prices came down dramatically. So, and I think some of them were shuttering their doors. So I think it's a mistake to think that this is a cash cow. Initially, it could be. So there's two pieces to this marijuana ordinance. One of them is that we have an issue, and I think all the council members know this, but the ordinance as written is not viable, and it's going to cause at least a 4-month to 4.5-month delay before we can even start to see revenues associated with that, and that's for the manufacturing side. The other part of it is, and I'll just tell you this, I went through some mental contortions, but in the first draft of the report, I put in there that it was highly inadvisable to consider dispensaries. Then, it's almost like I was selling my soul, because I come from a law enforcement background, but as the figures started adding up to the extent of our deficit, I actually changed the paragraph and wrote that the council might want to consider dispensaries, even though, there's some issues, moral, ethical, and, financial reliability issues associated with it. Nevertheless, you've already got your ordinance for the manufacturer. I don't, unless you, I just. I
Well,
think
we
we
have
just
our
leave that
ordinance
alone.
for manufacturer, but do you want to touch base on why we have to go backwards on that, or something that was missed, or is that something that we're not ready to
I think as
kind of roll out
the
just?
city manager alluded to, there was a determination in reviewing it that it's not
Okay.
legally viable.
Okay,
And so it was recommended that we start the process over, and in the process of in the work of starting it over, put back on the table for reevaluation all of the different options, particularly in light of the information that you have today. I've been on both sides in cities that we represented. Newman, as an example, decided to not allow it. Other communities such as Riverbank, Oakdale, and now Sonora, which kind of surprised me, have decided to allow it. And some of it's financial, but also there's a recognition that it currently already exists. It's legal in California. And the impacts that you're going to have to deal with from a law enforcement perspective and a community perspective, as people can go to potentially Merced or Ceres or Riverbank and Oakdale and any of these places and acquire marijuana and just bring it back. The impacts are here. Plus, if you were to go on Weed Maps right now, there's like 35 different delivery services that are dropping off right now in town illegally, and you don't have the resources to combat that unless you collect revenue that allows you to shut down those illegal operations. And we found that you're better off having a regulated environment and revenue that allows you then to prosecute these folks civilly, because the criminal side isn't picking them up anymore. It's too difficult to get convictions. And so the people who are operating illegally, when you actually threaten them with having to pay very significant fines, you get a lot more compliance with the law. So it's an interesting kind of dichotomy. The criminal aspect's does not dissuade folks, but the financial, civil side does.
But my understanding too is that Mitch McConnell is introduced to remove cannabis from the federal side as an illegal drug. But you also have to look at too, there is the other side, or another side of this. There's the CBD, which is the non-hallucinogenic side, the medical side. Also wants to do dispensaries. So we need to look at that as well.
Yeah, I think we'd look at both, and I think just as we go through this process, that we would present both to you, to give you just some numbers, and I don't say this to make you, as the city manager said, to make you rely on them, but just to give you an example. Ceres had its first one open up, been open for the first month, and it did $1.63 or $6 million in the first month, and the payment for 1 month's operation to the city was $100,000.
So what you're saying is that we look at the whole thing over again because there's some discrepancies with the original one, and that there's a potential, and open it all back up, that everything becomes put on the table. Then you can monetize the illegal activity by legalizing it and codifying it into city code, which would benefit the PD, would be able to capitalize on the income and revenue, which would enhance their department, which we're trying to do. At the same time, the operators would self-police, which would report, you said there's 30 different deliveries going on any given moment in Atwater, and we can't combat that because it's just happening. So we would engage them head-on and also monetize that activity.
Yeah, in order to be able to shut down the volume of illegal activity and marijuana distribution currently going on under a veiled legal auspices, meaning that they may have a license from LA, right? And then they're using that license to drop off or deliver marijuana to a doorstep at night in Atwater. In order to combat that, you have to reduce your existing level of service for your regular calls, or you have to add new revenue to it in order to be able to combat that. So you actually have the possibility of, by regulating it, reducing the amount of marijuana in your community by creating a revenue source so that law enforcement has a mechanism by which to shut down all the illegal operations that, again, are largely just coming in and dropping boxes on people's doorsteps at night.
And that's difficult to get a lot of people's head around, that by introducing this and legalizing it in the community, it actually benefits our law enforcement and gives them tools that they need that they don't currently have and strengthens them.
Did Ceres put a user tax on the ballot for marijuana, or is it all through development agreements?
So, what you'll see in a recommendation is both a development agreement coupled with a conditional use permit. The reason that we do the development agreement is I want to have a contract by which the arrangement is codified, and we have a series of law that allows for a public benefit fee. It's backed up with either a base amount or a 5% of gross revenue number. We will backstop that with a tax. It's supposed to be on the November ballot. In Dixon, we did it last year, but Stanislaus County tried to get together and do it all together, and it fell apart. There was too many cooks in the kitchen, and so everybody now, you'll see almost every city, and including Modesto and all those, which we don't represent, will all have something on the ballot in November to place a tax. The tax that we'll be requesting that council adopt, even if you don't want to allow dispensaries, would be a basis of 0 to 15%. That would give you the power to go up to 15%. That's not what we would recommend that you would impose. We'd recommend that you would impose somewhere around a 5% of gross revenue to 7%. But that's a backstop. The development agreement would exempt you out of that obligation. So if you have a contract with us, it's there. But the reason that the conditional use permit is so important is in litigation, it can take 2 or 3 years if you get into a fight with somebody to get a decision on that contract. A conditional use permit allows me within a course of 30 days to give somebody notice and hold a revocation hearing so that I can revoke their license and shut somebody down who's not living up to their obligations fairly quickly.
So you're talking about that 5 or 7% of the gross?
Yeah.
Is that a go-around from the 218?
It's not subject to 218 because it's a negotiated.
That's what I mean. So there are these loopholes that we can get around 218, because, if we have to do a 218 process, then.
I like to call them creative solutions.
Well, of course. But my point is because, and one of my other questions is, what of our current ordinance does not make it viable right now for at least the manufacturing end of it and the testing and, what we had originally approved? What is? So
aside from some of the legal issues, let me give you an example. Right now, you all would charge on a use per square foot basis for cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
Manufacturing, as an example, has a very, very small footprint. You might only yield $1,000 a month from the manufacturing of cannabis in Atwater, whereas the lowest agreement that I've negotiated in any of the other jurisdictions is a $10,000 a month basis, based off of whatever their gross revenue is. It's $10,000 or 5% of gross revenue, whichever is greater. So that's an example of what happened in Ceres, that even though their obligation was to pay at least $40,000 a month, because of where they were revenue-wise, it triggered a $100,000 obligation in terms of their first month's payment. So I think that there were some not understanding of the business model and how it probably, the way you're set up right now, it would cost more money to monitor and implement a manufacturing business. So you would actually lose money the way you're currently set up by going in and supervising a cannabis manufacturing, and you wouldn't make anything. You'd be like paying them to do business here, basically.
And now we could do that same thing with the CBD.
Correct.
The same concept could be used, because there is a gentleman who's come to council, he's willing to give up like 10% of the gross to go to the police department, which is huge.
Correct. We probably.
And he wants to hire veterans to do the work.
It would not be my.
Right.
It would not be my recommendation that we ever enter into agreements that designates where the fund goes to other places than general fund, because I think that should be reserved to council's discretion on an annual basis as these things come up.
But he has made that comment because, his father is a veteran and has benefited from this. So his thought process is to hire as many veterans as possible. So, which is a plus, for the city and for the state.
And the beauty of it is that if you were to decide to allow this, there's 2 different processes that these folks have to go through. It's a process that's open to the planning commission and open to the city council. So you have to have two different bodies that would approve different components of it. And so everybody would be subject to a lot of vetting.
Well, let's, just to be clear, what I'm hearing is, yes, pursue the information on dispensaries, right? And,
Well, if he's gonna have to do it, you're gonna have to.
I'm gonna have to bring it back anyways, yeah.
Well, what I'm asking is, are we gonna have to dispense with the original ordinance, just do away with it and do a complete rewrite? Is that what I'm hearing?
It's most cost effective to start over at this point.
Okay, so, and with that in mind, then, as you say, it's then to add in at our discretion the dispensaries or retail outlets, however you classify it within.
Yeah.
Which
And if anyone's-
we spent thousands and thousands of dollars on, and it's getting tossed in the trash can.
Yeah, I would look at Riverbank and Oakdale and Dixon, which are similar in size. Atwater's a little bit bigger than them, but I think that they have similar demographics and, cultural ethos.
Yeah.
So if you look at what we've done there, those will be good examples of what we would be proposing, with obviously the council's input to make it even more specific to Atwater, to the extent that you want to look at this.
Well, as I think Art had mentioned, the big surge of the new, the newfound product, and the legalities of it and everything else, that's all, real nice and all that, and there's probably that surge of revenue that would come from that. By the time we get around to this, that surge may be kind of dwindling. And again, as I stated when this originally came up, I'm a child of the '60s, and I can tell you, it don't take a whole hell of a lot to go and grow pot. And people are gonna figure out, well, why should I pay $50 or whatever it is when I can grow it in my closet for next to nothing? So I don't wanna go and have, I don't want us to get, caught in some kind of a quagmire here, where we think that we're
Take
gonna
it to
be
the dry
making
cleaners.
revenue, and in reality, it's not gonna be, the cash cow like Art says, that it's supposed to be.
So if I could, one of the good things about this is we have an agreement that would go somewhere between 3 and 5 years. I mean, some people go way beyond that. I don't believe in that because I think the regulatory system's gonna change too much. So I think there's some security for that period of time. That being said, what I've recommended in all of my cities is that this be treated as one-time money, and you only count on the money that you actually have. You don't count on the money that you're expecting to come in.
Yep.
And that's particularly important when you're making personnel decisions and basing it on that. So if you keep it like money that comes in when it's for capital projects and things that you do one time, we can reevaluate in a 3 to 5 year period of time once we have greater clarity as to what the legal landscape really looks like and how it has leveled out.
Well, it can help with like vehicle purchases.
Right,
versus
absolutely.
PD, fire, maintenance, everything. I mean, those are things where are one-time purchases, we really look at it.
But I would not recommend using that money and predicating a new hire.
Correct.
On that.
Personnel.
Okay.
If I
Yes,
can
go
just say
for it.
one real quick thing on, on that, and that amount that was quoted up there, and that's based on what we have in the manufacturing and the cultivation now with only 4 licensing. We didn't limit licensing. We know that we have at least 4, but we've had a lot of interest, so that number could increase once we get the process down, but because it's an ordinance, it is a time-framed process that can't be rushed through.
Yeah, and for the public, the reason it's 4 months is you have to y'all put everything in the zoning code, which is the worst to do in terms of time frame it takes to amend because of extra noticing periods. So it's in the zoning code. So that means we've got to do an extra long notice. We've got to then go to planning commission. Then we've got to do first reading at city council, second reading at city council, which obviously there's 2 weeks in between all of these different things. And then it doesn't take effect for 30 days. That's the reason it takes so long. When we're required by statute for all laws, that's the process. That's why people consider government to be so slow.
Okay, next slide.
Moving on past weed.
Are we
Okay.
doing, so to be clear, are we doing another study against the?
I think we gave direction to move forward with it.
So the next steps on marijuana, which would be irrespective, would be to, we'll be putting out the notice should be coming in today, so we'll be noticing something this week
Okay.
for the planning commission meeting. It will go to planning commission before, oh, I'm sorry, I keep saying planning commission. CDRC, before it comes to the city council.
Okay.
I got confused. So-
Okay, okay, this slide here, the only thing I need to say about it is that as I've been in this community, in all the different restaurants, I get asked about the budget situation, and I tell them basically that, that it's a difficult situation. And some of the unsolicited comments I get is, I sure hope you guys aren't gonna tax us so that we can pay for people, the government employees' retirements. And I think that's a sentiment that's widely held throughout, which goes back to what the mayor said a little while ago, relative to the utility user tax. I think the taxes that are specific, like to fire and police and some others, those might work, but if we just say, well, we need a general sales tax, and the reason is we're in the hole. Why are you in the hole? Well, we just went to a presentation, and it shows that, we're facing these huge increases in PERS, and it's gonna fall flat. Plus, it costs money to run a tax initiative, so. I don't know if, did you have anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to, but this is an option, again, we're putting everything on the table. This is separate from Measure H being continued, right? The reality is that in 2016 and 2015, the county did polling among all residents, including Atwater, about voter appetite for different types of tax measures. And while Measure V did pass, it passed because it was specific to transportation. It was very well laid out. There's a citizens oversight committee. There's a lot that goes in on it. Also, the cost of putting a sales tax measure on the ballot is quite high. The question here is whether or not there's actually a viable argument to do that. And we're going to talk about Measure H in a moment. But just from what we've seen in the data, exactly as Art said, and this is California-wide, it's not just here, overall distrust of government, a lot of concern about expanding pensions, why are they getting this and I'm not, and concern that all that this tax money does is go and basically pay for consultants and for cushy retirement benefits for people that, don't deserve them. That's the perception. So if this is an area that the council even remotely wants to get into, it absolutely would require an education program. It would require definitely, in our opinion, allocating resources for a very specific purpose, but we don't believe that a general fund tax at this point would have a prayer pretty much anywhere in the valley right about now. I see you all shaking your head going, you agree, so.
Personally, I think we need to really look at the enterprise, or the reevaluation of the sewer fees and the water fees.
We're getting there.
Yeah, I know, I understand, but I'm just
Yeah.
relaying it to that. I
Yeah.
think we need to look at those before we even address this.
Right, okay. Human resources, this is an area that we looked at. We don't really see any need for outsourcing. This seems to be a self-sufficient area in that it's needed by the city to move on, unless there's any questions for council on that. Police, Art.
Yes, so the way this slide is prepared, it says police department restructuring, and it seems to imply that restructuring would lead to 192K to up to 314K savings, but really, it's not about that. I'm basically just saying we need to cut one position from, the council should consider cutting one position from the PD, only because I think, all the other departments are taking hits and have taken big hits. And frankly, it was one of these last resort kind of ideas to help us get closer to, making up for the shortfalls that exist within the budget. But there is the potential for some restructuring as a result of the management audit that's taking place within the PD. I don't yet have the results of that, but I'm sure that with some of the work that's being done in terms of examining the PD, There may be some opportunities for savings that none of us have ever thought about. So, so there is the potential, but if you were to say, well, give us a definite figure for reduction within the PD, well, the answer would be we could cut one position. And I think, Gina can verify this, but for one police officer, I think at a senior level, the benefits are about 80% of what the total salary is. That's why it looks like it's close to $200,000 for one police officer position. And if you go up to a higher rank, like right now we don't have lieutenants, but if there were a lieutenant, it'd be closer to $240,000, $250,000. So that's all that is. This is something you can give us direction on if you want us to go further, if you want us to include that.
How many open positions for police officers do we have right now?
Well, we've got 2 frozen positions, and that was because we had a budget overrun over the course of this particular fiscal year. I don't know when we would be able to
So
refill
other
that.
than those 2 frozen positions, we're fully staffed in our PD?
Yeah.
No, I didn't think so. So what do we have on the street versus what we're budgeted for?
Right now, we have 24 officers sworn total. Currently, we're operating on 12-hour shifts. That was to try and eliminate some overtime issues.
Yes.
Staffing that. As a result of those shifts, we're going with 3 patrolmen and a sergeant. That's currently what we have right now. Over the
So for the 24 sworn, that's what we currently have. What did we budget for? How many sworn officers are in our budget that we approved?
I believe it's 26.
26. So we froze 2 already. So one of these would be to just leave one of those 2 frozen. It wouldn't be to take it down to 23.
Right, it would be to delete one position.
And part of the reason that we're freezing them is because we ran over our overtime budget quite a bit. To help eliminate overtime budget, have we looked into possibly working with reserve officers? And I'm just thinking with the reserve officers, if you have an overtime shift, they don't have medical, they don't have CalPERS. I know that they're usually young and maybe just getting out, but and we will be a training ground, but they've still gone through rigorous training. And sometimes you can get some really good, even retired officers that will work as reserves. And they're a lot cheaper for us, and it would help our overtime budget.
We used to run contract reserves, right?
We did.
It was just part-time.
Part-time, okay.
Yeah, I believe there's an issue, and I think Gina can kind of elaborate on that. Even if we've got the reserve officers that are working, there's a maximum time, correct? Where they can become a liability.
Yes.
So a maximum amount of time a week or a maximum amount of time over the years?
Fiscal year.
Fiscal year. So we know Doug wants to be a reserve, and he can only work 600 hours this year, and we need 1,200 hours this year, so we need 2. Because, am I correct in hearing that as of now, not even finished with our fiscal year, that we ran almost $200,000 over our overtime budget as to where we're at? So in seeing potential savings of 192, plus if we work within our overtime budget, maybe utilizing some reserve, I mean, that's a $500,000 savings right there.
We currently do have a reserve program.
Okay,
And right now, we do have 3 reserves that are going through the filtering process. Now, these are, and we have.
is that FTO?
Right. I'm
Okay.
sorry. And then we currently have 2 reserves that we do utilize for transport, details and those kinds of things. However, they're level as far as being able to put them on the street solo. They don't have that expertise to be able to go out and do that. So we do have and we've had open recruitments for the reserve officers. And that's obviously ongoing. It takes some time because these individuals are not compensated, so they are employed elsewhere. And so we have to try and work within.
Now, when I'm talking about a reserve, I'm not talking about a free reserve. they make an hourly wage, correct? They just don't get benefits and retirement.
Right now, they're unpaid except for special assignments if they're covering a shift or they're doing other detail. Other than that, they are unpaid.
We have 2 in the FTO process that are level 1 reserves.
So once they're out of FTO, they'll remain reserves but be able to pull a shift on their own? Okay, so they're unpaid until they clear FTO.
And then on specialty.
Okay. And do you see, I mean, where my idea is going with this, do you see a potential for a large savings if we could get,
Potentially, yes. The problem is recruitment and retention. That's.
so then I want to know this. Where, and I know we don't have a lot of people do this, where are we recruiting? And who is recruiting?
We do know that we have sent officers from our agency to local academies to do recruitments. Obviously, you know, when you're competing with cities in the Bay Area, we're not as lucrative to have individuals that want to come to work. Ultimately, that's what it boils down to. So we do have that ability, individuals that are considering law enforcement as a career, but they're still not sure whether that's what they really want to do. That's where we end up with the reserves. And, matter of fact, we just had one of our reserves resign from the position because he realized that this was not what
You want to
was
do.
going to work for him. And so we have that issue that we're constantly dealing with. And we're not the only ones. Look throughout the nation for that matter. There's an issue regarding recruitment and retention.
Right. Moving to the 12 hours, how is that, what kind of savings do you see with that in our overtime budget?
The overtime has been cut down tremendously because I do the time sheets. We don't have a lot of shift coverage anymore, so there's less shifts to fill with 12s. Part of the problem that you're also going to run into with the reserve is we have an MOU. And so if that reserve signs up for one of those shifts, a full-time can bump them. And so then we incur an overtime cost.
So I think, Councilman, what you want is when we bring this back in maybe in more detail, you want an analysis of how much we could potentially save through a volunteer program that's unpaid, a volunteer program that is compensated, and then just an analysis of overtime in general.
And then just looking at the range of savings from freezing that one, can we get the same result by simply very meticulously watching that overtime budget? Because we've really blown an entire officer on overtime. Yeah, okay.
I do want to reinforce that these 2 individuals have made a huge dent in the pattern of expenditure that was taking place. Is very impressive. And at the same time, I am hearing a lot of obstacles being talked about. And that's a natural default position because there are a lot of problems, even in the regular police profession where people are being compensated because it's such a negative working environment. But I think staff is prepared to revisit it, just like we're doing here and what we've done in preparation for this discussion today, see what the other options are. Is there some stuff that we haven't considered? So we can do a little think tank activity and see if there's some ways to increase the use of reserves. But over the couple of years that I've been exposed to this organization, I know that there was extensive use of reserves, but they were paid. I don't know if they really had any.
We've kept some long-term people that we eventually made full-time officers, but they put about 4 to 5 years in as a reserve until they built up their expertise and we were able to find money in the budget to hire them. And they became good candidates because we trained them and we didn't.
You knew what you had.
We knew what we had.
It was 2014 or 15, we hired, four or five of them full-time? Was it 7?
We lost 2 of our reserves that we had that came full-time to another agency just through attrition.
Yeah.
What would be the difference between reserve or a part-time classification?
So reserves are police officers while they're on duty.
Right.
And they can't carry off duty. Part-time, if you're 830.1 defined to the penal code, you can carry, on or off duty. Part-time is just regulated the hours, but then again, if they're a part-time employee, I don't think that they would receive benefits, correct?
It depends if they're
Or a
temporary or
minimum.
regular status.
They don't have a peace officer power off duty.
Right, well, I'm just throwing that out there as, as a different classification, and what the cost benefit would be to, making that part-time
So
reserve
not a-
designation.
A lot of people that are retired will come back sometimes and either pick up a reserve or maybe trying to find a part-time status, maybe working in the schools or detectives or something to that nature, but getting agencies to hire them, that's a different story.
Essentially, those retirees rejoin their own agency. They're already familiar with the process and procedures, and those agencies are already familiar with that individual themselves and their capabilities. Unfortunately, we don't, we have, I believe in the past, had former officers that have come back, but their stay has been short-lived.
Where do your CSOs fall in that?
I'm sorry?
Where do the CSOs fall in that?
Currently, we have one CSO who is a reserve, that he is our currently, he doubles as a community service officer and our animal control officer. So what will happen with him on occasion, he is utilized to supplement patrol level in the event that we have multiple individuals that need to be booked into county jail or supervise or guard, so to speak, at the hospital facility for medical treatment. So we're not tying up a full-time officer. So we will go ahead and utilize that individual to do so. And then we do have another level 2 reserve that we can also call out and also assist, and he does that on a regular basis for us.
Okay, I have a question then. So what are we recommending then, after all this discussion on this
Well, I
slide?
was asking for direction on how seriously to take the reduction of one police officer position from the agency. And I'm also hearing, not necessarily by consensus, I'd like to have that affirmed, that we would explore to expand the nature and the scope of our reserve program. And if that's what you'd like, that's what we will do and come back with a report.
And there's no benefit to exploring a part-time, correct?
I don't think so, but I'd like to, that's an off-the-cuff answer on my part. I'd like to.
At least make it part of the study.
Yeah, we can ask Post, they might know of some examples where a program like that exists. I haven't heard of one. Usually it's a reserve is a reserve and a full-time comp is that. But it's the 80 to 85% benefits that if we could deal with that and still provide some coverage. Anyway, I'm dragging this out, so.
Okay.
Okay, so moving on.
Next slide, I'll start off with that. Actually, this is yours.
Yeah, and what I'm going to suggest, just looking at the clock with the concurrence of the city manager, we have just a few more slides that are on this portion where council direction, and then maybe we can take a quick 5 minutes, people can breathe, and then come
Good
back
idea.
through the staff
Is that okay with you?
recommendations, if that's cool with everyone. Okay. One of the recommendations or asks for council direction is to consider shifting to contract services with a cost recovery model for community development. This is pretty popular in various jurisdictions across the state, and what it means is that your day-to-day planning, building, and engineering operations are handled by contractors that work specifically with applicants, and then their fees are basically recovered through the applicant process. So if I'm going to build a house or I'm going to do a subdivision, I would work with a planner, and I would pay the city X number of dollars per hour for that planner, plus a percentage on top of that, which we'll talk about in a moment in master fees, that recovers administrative costs for basically Lori and other staff to kind of manage those people. The advantages are that, number one, you don't have full-time staff, so they are out of the PERS section, and it allows you to fluctuate your workload so that if you have a huge rush of people coming in that needs permits, you can staff up, and if nothing's happening, you would staff down.
They would staff up.
They
or
would,
staff down.
yeah, exactly. And the other advantage of that, too, is just the ability to sort of, I would say, right size. Now, One of the other things we looked at on that is that depending on the complexity of the project being proposed, different planners have different levels of expertise. So it would be possible to use someone that was more of a associate level planner or a junior planner to process things like, a second unit. But when we get into something like a subdivision or a more complicated thing, you'd want to have someone with more experience. And that allows you to get the right person with the applicant to make that happen. The other piece on this is that you would likely see a focus on something along the lines of counter hours, where applicants would have X days of the week to come in or by appointment. And again, this is not uncommon throughout California for similar sized jurisdictions. And frankly, in most cases, I'd say the applicants actually prefer it because it allows them to get sort of a hand-holding, an individual that works for them, basically, or they work for the city, through the city, but someone that is constantly there to, serve their needs. We estimated this based on the current costs associated with the number of permits, that the savings would be approximately $200,000 a year. So what we're looking for on that is whether or not that's something that council would like to consider. And if they would like to consider outsourcing those services, we would put that in the next go-round report with a more specific application. What that would mean is we would probably look at releasing a request for qualifications and get what we would call a bench, which would be a number of individuals and or firms that could provide services, and then they would be utilized on a as-needed basis.
And once again, there's the benefit in terms of the PERS implications. So
All I know is I've heard nothing but good things from the business community since we've implemented.
The partial here?
Yeah, the partial contract services now, so I can see it only getting better.
Yeah, I've actually heard the compliments on the service and what Lori's done over there, so with the new outfit we have working over there, that things are turning around much faster. They get to worry about staffing up and doing everything else where, we take it into the counter, and then they have the workload they have to deal with, and they charge through the fees, and so it's already benefiting us tremendously.
And I just wanted to comment on that. We kind of started this out of a necessity because we had an employee that was out. So we've kind of seen how it would work in our department, and the quality and the workload that we get out of that has been great. We've gotten to do a lot more projects. We've got a lot of things going through, so.
Saved a couple of projects too.
So I'm seeing nods across the.
Yes.
Okay.
And I just want to point something out for the building division. We are solvent, with the help with the council, we passed and so any contracted services that we use, everything's covered. Actually, we're putting in with a positive effect into the budget. We're actually adding to the general fund, so.
And I want to say too, that part of this describes engineering and planning. We do have staff that maybe would need to do the day-to-day operations, managing the projects that we have, the counter work, things like that. So that in itself might not go away, but that would offset what we have.
So is the savings mainly that we're basically recovering that cost?
Well, actually, the way it's projected, it's a little bit twofold, and it depends on how you structure it, and I think that's something we'd want to come back to council with a more detailed look. But it's possible to contract the day-to-day operations at the counter as well as the actual application processing, and it really just depends on the combination that's best suited. We've looked through the number of permits that have been issued and just didn't feel that there was, they didn't warrant a full-time staff person to handle that, especially when somebody gets one and they can move on to something else. So it really just becomes a question of what's the best use of that department time and money.
Good.
Okay. Lighting and landscaping districts.
Yeah, I'll kick that one off. This is actually a fairly in-depth, complex issue, even when staff discusses it in a focused fashion. I'm wondering if we should take our break now and then get into this, because I think this is going to take a few minutes on this one.
Okay.
It'll take 10 minutes.
Little 5-second intro on this slide here. We did not list this $152,000 in this spreadsheet. because hopefully we won't, here's my point, we don't want to have to account for this 152K. So this subject is up here so that the council can give direction on how to deal with what's right now standing at $152,000 shortfall. So.
Okay, I think you guys have all figured out at this point that I'm blunt, so I'm not going to not be blunt about this. You have 54 lighting and landscape districts. Each one has a study that has been conducted that says this is how much it costs to provide the service in order to keep the landscape and lighting district up. 11 of those are underfunded, which means that the council has not approved the amounts that were required in the Nexus study in order for them to be solvent. Now, what's interesting about this is some of the others have an excess of funds, but by law, Doug will talk about this in a moment, you can't take from a fund that has money and pay for the fund that does not have money. So last I saw, Wildan created a report that was brought before council in November of 2017, and it outlined these districts and what the costs for maintaining them would be, and council did not take action on that. In order to retire or to make sure that this is a sustaining, these funds are self-sustaining moving forward, it will be necessary for council to adopt fees that are consistent with that study. If the council feels that that study was not valid or was flawed in some way, that's certainly something we want to hear about. But not recouping those funds basically means that you're leaving those districts in arrears, upside down, and at some point it could negatively affect the general fund balance.
Yeah, just, I think Kendall said most of the legal stuff, so one of the things I want to just touch on is what's happening here is, I think, endemic of what's happening systematically throughout the city, which is that fund balance or your fees, you've left them artificially low to the point to where it's gone for such an extended period of time that they're operating now at a deficit. It also means that when you increase the fees, because they haven't been increased on a regular basis, the increase would be much, much more dramatic to folks, which could come as a shock and bring some unpleasant feelings for some folks. In addition to not keeping the fee schedules up, so that each of these districts remain solvent. Fees that should be created, like for instance a general plan fee, just don't exist. So you don't even have all of the fees that you need. And so, not only do you want to keep your fee schedules up, you want to make sure that you have the fees that you need that are in place, and you want to make sure that if you can create efficiencies with these, so for instance combining these into some kind of different financing mechanism like a CFD, that you look at those and see if it's appropriate. Not only will that perhaps give you more flexibility in terms of balancing these funds, but it has the ability to reduce staff time in terms of, you can imagine it's a lot easier to administer 2 to 4 funds as opposed to 54 funds. So.
Well, I think the important thing though is that we've discussed this internally as staff, and it is absolutely possible to combine some of these, to recombine, to figure out new ways of putting the districts together. But in order to do that, you have to have these 54 districts solvent. So you can't take the ones that are upside down and then put them into another category. So a couple things that we're looking for. One is, the city council's willingness to implement the fees that were suggested, 1, and 2, to get direction on whether or not you'd like staff to examine either combining or figuring out a different way of delivering those services across the city. Because 54 districts for a city of this size is high. And there's a lot going on, again, that impacts our administrative costs and also tracking. So if we were at a regular council meeting, the staff recommendation would be accept the fees, get that money, get it even, and then direct staff to explore ways of either consolidating districts or figuring out another delivery mechanism to deliver the service.
One other component that I think is important to mention on this is you don't want to have 11 funds that you're giving extra general fund money. So the entire city's contributing to subsidizing 11 funds, or 11 districts, and then all these other districts are on their own and having to pay and be solvent. So it creates some inequities if you don't address it as well.
Well, I think there's also another component to this too, is like downtown, the business people are complaining about their street lights and everything else not being kept up or not being sufficient. So there's the question about, do we want to create a lighting district down there as well, which would be also encompassing with the other 54.
Or,
So-
like he said, it's citywide.
Yeah, so we
A
need to do it
citywide
citywide. If
option-
we're gonna do that, we need to do it citywide.
And all those things are, and actually, a citywide lighting district is actually a little bit easier to administer than a landscaping district because there's different levels of landscaping in different places. And these are ones that require what's called a nexus study, which ensures that whatever you're paying is the appropriate fair share for the benefit you receive. So, I can't pay more for you to have more. I need to pay only what my fair share is. But I think for purposes of today's discussion, is there a willingness for the council to revisit the fees for the lighting and landscape districts that perhaps you weren't thrilled about before?
You're
Get
talking
those
about
passed.
the engineer reports.
Yeah, get those passed on an upcoming agenda, and then perhaps direct staff to explore the consolidation. I'm seeing everybody shaking their head on that one.
I think we need to look at it without causing too much culture shock.
All right, well, that went a lot easier than we all thought. Let's move on. Measure H is expiring in 2023. Now, when a ballot measure expires, you normally want to look for your extension in advance of that happening, right? So when you look at the upcoming election cycles from a strictly factual standpoint, the 2020 election is probably your best shot because it's a presidential election. You get a higher voter turnout. There's a lot of things to go with that. Currently, there are revenues of $1.8 million a year, and expenditures are a little over $2 million. We talked about that earlier, about how we're kind of offsetting police and fire services. The couple things that we'd like to get feedback on council. One recommendation is that we really need to consider polling, which would likely take place in 2018, 2019, to determine the viability of extending that for the 2020 ballot, right? I want to be clear on this. The city cannot, by law, advocate. It can only educate. So the idea is all the city would be doing is going out to the public and saying, look, is this, through this polling mechanism, is this something you would like to see continued? If yes, what kind of things do you want to see it on? If no, what are your concerns? And then should you decide to put this on the ballot for 2020, separate actions would have to be taken by either a political action committee or others to support or oppose that. Without that funding moving forward, your abilities to deliver police and fire services are seriously damaged. I mean, there's just no other way around that. They're a substantial part of your budget. One other thing you might consider, and again, we don't have to determine this today, I would suggest you would wait until after you do polling. You might consider changing that from a ½ cent to a ¾ cent tax, because that would then offset the additional amount you have under. In full disclosure, one of the challenges you're going to have is public perception that you're kind of in this tenuous state right now. What did you do with the money before? So, it's going to be tricky either way. But again, we want to hear from council about, is that something you want to consider and get that on the path? Because it is a substantial expense, but without getting started early, you will not be prepared for the 2020 election.
So all you're asking for is direction to council to consider earmarking the $50,000 for the research. That's it. We're not talking about doing anything else.
No,
We're talking 2020.
I would suggest 2020 because the 2022 will be a lighter turnout, and frankly, it's not enough time for you to get the stuff in place to begin collecting.
So it'd be 1920 budget for the 50.
Yeah. And again, we don't have to decide it today. We're just kind of looking for a consensus nod if that's something that you would consider, and then we'll put that into our projections.
In other words, bringing it back for discussion, is that
Well, when we come back and look at your overall budget based on all the things we're talking about today, we're going to figure that into the mix. So we're going to say, council, here's the 1 point whatever million you cut, here's the revenues that we're going to save, here's the revenues we're going to generate, and here's the additional costs that you've agreed to include in. And at some point, as we were talking about previously, that may include cost of living increases for staff. That may include the dissolution of furlough, but it'll time those all out over a period of years, balanced with the things you're going to be cutting back on, because you can't have one without the other, right? But if this is important to you, and we believe it is, because if you don't have H, you're going to have a challenge. So if everybody's generally okay with that, then we'll put that in the projection. Generally okay? Okay. Payroll outsourcing, this is a pretty easy one. Right now, the city has a single individual that's doing payroll. The question is whether or not we want to just take a look at that. And I think it's much like some of the other services, just to look and see on the model. If there's a cheaper, better way, faster way to do it, we would explore that. If it's not more efficient, then we'd leave it the way it is.
No brainer.
Okay, no brainer there. I like hearing that. So all the things we talked about today thus far, really, if everything came true, that's a potential of $1.46 million per year in savings, which is more than our target. But I think we wanted to also keep in mind that things like the marijuana options may or may not be a long-term solution. So if you chose to move forward with all of these or some of these, certainly it's getting us closer down the road. It's still potentially not enough, but you'll see this again when we come back to you. So I want to go through right now the things that staff are doing. These will go through a little bit faster because, again, these are things that staff is already accomplishing, and when we come back and see you again, we'll have an update on that, but also be able to get some input from you today. Biggest one up there, and Doug mentioned it to begin with, your master fee schedule is way out of date, with the exception, I'm going to say, of Mark's, because he's done, his is right dead on and up there. When we talk about a master fee schedule, I'm going to use planning and building as the example, but mainly planning. California state law allows you to add administrative costs onto your fee, as well as a retention fee a special fee for future general plan updates, development codes, housing elements, all those things. It can range between 5 and 15, 20%. You haven't been collecting that in years, and your fees are very low. So the first thing we would do is take a look at your master fee schedule, and we do mean everything. So that's park rentals, anything that the city charges a fee for, and make sure that that fee is appropriate. And that when I say appropriate, it adequately, it represents the cost recovery, again, for delivering that service. So the idea is not to make you, I know some people get concerned, well, are we going to be less economically attractive? We're kind of past that point because, if you're not a city, you're really not attractive. So we want you to be as attractive as possible while still being, affordable. So the idea, again, through a nexus study, we would look at planning, building, engineering, parks and recreation fees, user fees, impact fees, business license fees, and there's a couple fees out there that you haven't charged yet. Now, I want to be clear, we're not talking about making up a fantasy fee just to get another revenue stream, right? It has to be for something that the city's actually doing. But we have council concurrence that that's something that you're willing to support, that'll make it a lot easier when we come back and say, here's what it costs to do these things. Here's what you need to do. Doug, did you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, there's one other thing. I mean, I don't want you all to think about this just in the context of no longer being a city, because it doesn't actually take that to have really negative implications. Just an adverse finance rating, which then makes all your bonding capacity cost more money. So, to get money, now it costs more. So for the same amount of dollars, you get less than your neighboring jurisdiction. That can have as much or a greater impact on development than charging higher fees. So I just want you to bear that in mind.
Absolutely. So that we have some major development that could be coming in, which could be great for the city, but they're going to be concerned about its ability to maintain its infrastructure and whatnot. I saw 5 nods across there, so I think we're good on that one. Okay. Atwater Emergency Communications Center. Do one of you guys want to take that one? Yeah.
So, looking at the Atwater Emergency Communications Center, due to the antiquated equipment, it's very difficult to maintain and calculate what the actual fees are. Infrastructure has been ignored in the past, directly causing this result that it is today. It's basically a direct negligence, of the whole situation. So it's difficult to maintain.
So this is a look-see to see what comes out of it. We'll come back and report what the information is there. Fleet fuel purchase, this is also kind of a no-brainer. If we can collectively buy in bulk or buy in bulk with other agencies, reducing the fuel cost, I think everybody's good with that.
Are you talking about going outside the corporate yard to do it? Everybody gets an identified card, and they buy at a fleet purchasing or around town, and then you're able to track the fuel much more efficiently than what we currently do.
Or perhaps going to a different vendor that will supply it for a more inexpensive rate. We'll look at the contracts and the agreements that we have, make sure that we're getting the best pricing available.
What about the card lock system?
That's what I'm talking about, what the mayor's saying.
Well,
Right now, we physically have a spot in the courtyard that takes up space. The mechanics have to maintain the system at a cost. The regulatory component with the clean air board and everybody else, and there's just a lot of components to it. And then the disappearance of X gallons a year. With the card lock, you could track each individual to the fraction of a gallon.
Okay.
The basic point is, we just want to revisit, make sure that we're spending what we should be as opposed to what we are.
Garbage collection contract. This is one that we have had quite a bit of discussion about. At the end of the year, the city would have paid off a negative balance, but one of the things we looked at, the city is now in year 6 of a 10-year contract from a previous contract that was 10 years. And the question really is just asking council if they are at all interested, and we're certainly recommending that you do, review that contract, review the franchise fees that are being paid, and determine if those are in fact appropriate, and whether or not there's a need to either go back out to RFP or renegotiate that contract, just to ensure we're getting the best possible deal for the city. The contractor right now is paying $1,000 a month to use space for storage and whatnot, and does pay franchise fees to the city. Again, the question is not we're not criticizing them, we're just saying, is that the best deal we can possibly get? Doug, did you want to?
Mayor, if I could make an exception to the nature of our meeting, I did ask Kyle to come here, and he'd like to say something. Is that still correct? Okay, come on, just keep it short, please.
Council, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, we are in year 5 of a 10-year contract. We have had a very long relationship with Atwater. We've been here for quite some time. That contract did go out to RFP. It did go out to bid. We did reapply for a contract we originally had, and we won that contract. When we started that contract, as my boss came, Keith Hester came last year, came and spoke to you, talked about that long relationship we had, and reminded folks of the how we came to help the city out when we had that contract. We do pay $1,000 a month for rent. But when we signed the contract, we also fronted the city $400,000 in leases in advance. So if you look at it, we were actually paying about $4,300 a month in rent to the city for that facility. We moved from our facility at Castle to the city's yard to help out. And so we do that because we've had that long relationship with the city. We appreciate that long relationship. And as she stated, we do pay 10% franchise fee. Looking at over the last 12 months, that's been, I want to say about $230,000 into the city's general fund through our franchise fees. So between that and our rent that we're paying, we put about $250,000 into the city's general fund every year. We enjoy our relationship with the city. Our contract is another 5 years. Going out to RFP is going to cost the city money to do so. The contract now allows for an extension of 10-year contract. We really hope that the council would recommend that the city manager sit down with us to negotiate how we can add that extension of 10 years and see how we can again help the city with their general fund issues.
I mean, it is a flawed contract that negatively impacts the residents of the city, so it needs to be reviewed.
Okay,
Okay.
is that
So-
the desire?
Review and we'll go on from there. Phone and IT system, this is one that staff is currently reviewing. There's equipment that's outdated, there's equipment that's not being utilized, and this will be something that will be reported back to council, whether or not there's an ability for cost savings in terms of the management of it, what kind of replacement things we might have to go. At this point, it's in process. Street cleaning, kudos to street cleaning. Street cleaning is the poster child for how a department should work at the city, because street cleaning performs a service, gets paid for the service, and everybody breaks even, which is exactly as it should be. So,
If we swept everywhere.
Huh? Yeah, street cleaning everywhere.
No, if we did do
Huh?
that everywhere. If we did sweep everywhere.
Yeah.
We need to work on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Yep,
how
go
is
ahead.
it that it's self-supporting, right?
So if a service is provided and there's a cost associated with that at the city, and the charges that are made to ratepayers offset that cost and it's at a break even, we're good. If the cost of providing the service to the ratepayers is higher than the rate that's being paid, we're upside down. If the cost of the service is lower than what's being paid by the ratepayers, then that also has to be revisited, because by law, the city cannot overcharge ratepayers for a service that it provides.
Well, I think we need to look at that in a little more detail, because we have several hundred tons of debris still at a site the city owns.
Okay.
That's not getting hauled to the dump, and we're not doing the commercial areas and the downtown district, the industrial area, and the Walmart Target area as we should. And there's confusion on, you have to sweep, your day's Tuesday, it's coming, rain or shine, and I watch it go by in the rain, and there's nothing in the gutter but water. I'm going, so there's confusion on how this operates, and, I question whether it's running positive, because it doesn't do a lot of things that it's designed to do, and then the debris needs to be hauled away.
Okay.
We're accumulating that stuff.
So let's take a look at that and figure out if there's opportunities there for sure, but if it's, I'm nodding here, he's nodding, yeah.
I also think you need to look at, there's at least one gated community that pays for the service and never gets it.
Really?
Yes,
Okay,
so,
Yeah,
that I do know of, there may be more, so.
Okay.
that's
All right.
the bell,
So
up there on
staff
bell.
needs to address all those
They want
to
the
see if
streets.
it's
But still keep it
Okay.
revenue, expenditure neutral.
let's
Yes.
talk, we'll take a look
We
at
just
that,
need to
I'm
look at
sure,
that service.
I'm sure staff is happy to do that. Let's talk about animal control services. Currently, staff is negotiating with Merced County. Did you want to check on that one, Art?
Yeah, well, there's already some discussion underway regarding this whole, the animal services system is a pretty big burden on the city's general fund. And staff is enthusiastic about really digging deep, and actually, I already know a lot about the Stanislaus County model. It works great, but the whole point is that we need to have in place a very aggressive licensing and tagging program, and of course the licensing is what drives the whole system, and that's the way you can curtail costs, increase revenues, and all those things. So to me, it seems like a no-brainer that we would keep moving forward, and like I said, we probably don't even need to reinvent the wheel, we just need to do this thing. And by the way, our contract with the county was expired for how long?
Since June of last year.
Yeah, so we need to negotiate what we're already doing and then make a much better model that works for our city. So I'm hoping you support that effort, and we're actually enthusiastic about it, because I think we can save a bunch of money. We just don't know how much yet.
I think you need to kind of include, look into the chipping as well as
Yes.
tagging.
That's what I
haven't
meant,
thought about-
but-
Yeah, because I do know there's a lot of dogs and stuff running around with no collars on, and they probably have been licensed or expired, and they just take the collars off and let them run. So, yeah,
What's also costing,
I'm absolutely a problem.
what's also a driver on this is, this has been a pet project with me, if you will, from about, get it, 2.5 years ago. Thank you, Paul. But the cost in this, for example, anybody dropping off an animal over there, whether it's been tagged, with license fees and all this kind of stuff, it's costing us. A dead animal costs us. We had an incident here, I don't know, if it's 9-10 months ago, I guess, something like that, where there were 4 or 5 dogs within an area where the guy that owned them passed away. They went to remove the dogs. His son tried to get rid of them. Our guys couldn't get rid of them because we're not set up as an animal control type of a scenario. We don't have the dart guns and stuff like that. So we had to go to the county and ask if the sheriff's department, who is able to do that, come out and assist our guy, and that's what happened right there. There's a lot of cost association here. One of the things that in the research I've done with this is, and I don't know if anybody else has looked at it, but Los Banos has their own facility out there, and it's volunteer run, and they get revenues and stuff from their licenses and what have you. So it's kind of a self-sustaining type of thing. But we've got to do something about this cost, because you're absolutely correct. It is a lot of money, And oftentimes, the facility is full of animals. They can't take them. They wind up getting just tossed out on the street. They're running loose. They get picked up again. It's a mess. And even if somebody just drops off a dog because they're trying to be humanitarian, where are you from? I'm from Atwater. Great. What is it, $98 or something like that? To just drop off an animal out there and the taxpayers are picking that up. That's a broken system. And we've got to engage in some conversation to get that fixed.
Well, there's even some other hidden costs that nobody knew about until very recently, that some deals had been cut that weren't formalized by the council. But anyway, I think we got direction on this. We know it's an issue, and we're enthusiastic about tackling it.
So we're also, as I mentioned previously in the master fee schedule, we're looking at business licenses and how they're renewed and how often they're renewed, what they're used for. So that's something that we're looking at and reviewing the process with staff. Fire marshal services, this is actually already happening where the city is collecting fees for fire reviews and inspections. That's just not a huge amount of money, but it's definitely a better utilization of staff services moving forward. Parking violations, a lot of these, if you've ever had the fun, which I certainly have, of going to the DMV and having them tack your parking ticket onto your registration, that's great, but don't look at me like that. But there are other fees out there, so we are working with PD and others. Could be things like code enforcement, all types of stuff, but really making sure that the city is doing everything it can to get that back. Police tow yard, go bye-bye. Basically because it was not a revenue generator, and that's shifting over to where other folks will pick up cars and take them away and then pay a franchise fee back to the city. So rather than being a money loser, that becomes a revenue generator. Not necessarily a huge amount of money, but again, keeping us away from losing money.
With the tow yard, we paid over, what, $50,000 in startup costs?
Yes.
And it only brought in $13,000, so we ended up at a net loss of, what, $37,000?
Well, actually, according to this, it's not
No,
quite
it
enough.
did brought in,
It did,
about
okay.
50, yes.
Okay.
It just did not work out for the manpower required and for all the management of it and everything else. It just was not a sustainable type of program. So this shift is going to be more efficient, more effective.
Okay.
Okay. The solar contract with Con Energy.
Formerly Con Energy.
Formerly Con Energy. There's going to be some challenges with this one. I think Doug's going to be taking a look at that contract to determine whether or not there's some issues that can be mitigated. And I'm assuming that we'll come back to council with the report on that to determine later.
Can I ask a quick question? of
Sure.
LaQuinder, the cost associated with the amount of energy and all that, remember before we had a discussion a couple years
Right,
ago?
so we-
44,000 turned to 74,000 or so, something?
Yes, so we did update that study this year, pretty much recently, 2-3 months ago. So this year we are saving money on our solar system. But it could be different story next year because in our contract, the per kilowatt rate increases every year.
Right.
So since we started that contract, like 2 years behind from the contract price, so right now, for this current fiscal year, PG&E's rate are 2 cents higher than solar, so that's why we are saving some money. But next year, it's gonna be pretty comparable for PG&E and our solar contract. Then after that, if PG&E comes up with new implementation and with new inventions, when they're not raising their prices as much, then there's gonna be a point where solar contract price will be higher than PG&E.
And what about the overage costs that we incurred?
That was basically, like I said, we are consuming more energy during this year and in the previous year. So just because the solar rate was less than PG&E, so we saved money for that year.
Okay, well, I'm,
But not very much.
yeah, right, yeah, because I was gonna
But
say,
at least we were not losing, sorry.
our water pumps that had the solar attachment to it,
Correct, and
And-
well number 17 had
Right.
it, and which was pretty much 24/7.
we were paying overage on that, and that,
Correct.
okay.
Now it's covered, yes.
Okay, the actually, one of the final slides regarding revenue generating is staff is currently assessing current property that is owned by the city at this point and eligible for sale, with the idea that selling this property off might in fact be enough revenue to generate retiring the sewer fund debt. So basically, that would offset that and then assist us in again, moving closer to that solvency side of the house. So at this point, I think there's about 2.3, 2.5, we think, in property value that's out there. That would come back before council for your approval before it is sold, and then you'll be able to designate how those revenues are administered. But that's, again, move in the right direction. There's no point in having the property out there if it's not being properly utilized. That's all of the things we've looked at. We're certainly open to other things. As it pertains to implementation, which is getting it done, the idea here is that, from what I think we're going towards today, we would meet again to have a next step presentation with the council so that you could give us actionable items on various things that we've discussed today so we can present that information and then move forward. The piece on here is also using outside consultants, myself or somebody else, I don't know who that's going to be, but you're going to need help on the transitioning to get this done. Staff would be, including Art and others, providing council updates at all the meetings moving forward. This is going to be something that should be right at the front of everything you're doing for the next several months, if not several years. And then most importantly, which we recommend highly, the public absolutely needs to have complete understanding about what you're doing, what steps are being taken, how it's going to affect them. And if they have ideas, which I'm sure they will, opportunities for them to weigh in on that as well. And one of the things that Art and I discussed was, following this, perhaps in the next couple of weeks, it'd be great to have some sort of a community open house, town forum, whatever it is, where you present a lot of these ideas that council's floating out there, let folks, have their piece with it as well. But keep in mind, it's everybody wants to keep the services at the level that they have. Everybody's going to want to keep all these things. But as council people, you have the tough job as elected officials, frankly, to make those decisions of what to cut and what not to cut. So by all means, be open to the public, be open to public comment, but know that by the end of the day, you're probably going to tick somebody off. And that's part of the joy of being an elected official, but it's also part of the stewardship of making sure that the city is able to move forward. That concludes our pieces of questions. I think, Art?
Yeah, I'd like to have you all take out your spreadsheet here, and LaQuinder may have to help me. I just want to point out how you can use this tool to make some direction decisions, not decision decisions. But if you, the 2018 column really speaks for itself, but if you go to 2019, you can see that if we made no changes, there, for the next fiscal year, there's going to be an estimated 5% increase in revenues and the same for expenditures. Except that we have these two unavoidable costs, which is CalPERS. That's our first bigger installment of $342,830. We might as well call it $343,000. And then the unavoidable increase in CAL FIRE of almost $150,000. So that leaves us, with that model, it leaves us with a shortfall of $332,000. Here is where we need some direction on top of, no, not direction, yeah, direction. On top of what we've already talked about. How interested are you in us further pursuing furlough elimination? How interested, and I have that same question for every one of these. And I want to point out that the way you could use this as a tool is you can go down to the, what color is it, purple?
Purple is the bottom one,
Yeah.
the reductions.
So you can see these reductions if you're particularly interested in us pursuing those, and I think we're feeling the direction on that. But you can then, you can contrast that to, okay, well, since we have at the bottom line a $231,000 shortfall projected for the next year, if we do all of these things, like building up a general fund reserve in the amount of $500,000, which I think is absolutely critical. We are so vulnerable right now because we have nothing. If there's a major piece of equipment that breaks down, we don't have anything to cover. So what I'm saying is, you could adopt all of these measures, like doing what I think for the OPEBs, the 100,000, to me, that's a paltry installment, given the fact that this tends to grow exponentially. You have that $7.75 million unfunded liability. Frankly, I'd like to see more than that, but staff was trying to just make something that appeared to be workable. So anyway, you could reduce the amount of the general fund reserve. So as LaQuinder starts developing a proposed budget, she needs some direction on that. How much would you really like us to put in for the OPEB? The implementation costs that you see listed here, that's what Kendall just talked about, and that is we're going to need some outside assistance to implement these potential suggested reductions. For example, the privatization and some of the other things there. So anyway, that's the tool that I think if you can use that as kind of your Bible, we've really refined these numbers as much as possible. We think it's doable. I think you can see in front of you that there is the possibility. I mean, theoretically, you could balance this budget right now. If all these things work out as staff and the consultants forecast, that's why she was saying earlier that there is a solution. It's just going to take those decisions. And here is what it looks like, and you can tinker with it, you can adjust it, but we need direction.
One thing I want to make a correction on, I hope, anyway. At the last budget, at the approval of that budget, we had what was a surplus of $250,000, and I asked for a $50,000 set aside for reserve. And I keep hearing we've got nothing. So what happened to 50 grand?
When the budget got adopted, I was on leave, so that message was not delivered, or a separate account was not created. I think 2 months ago or so, Mr. Vineyard brought that to my attention, saying that the budget was adopted with that condition. So, of course, we are in the process of creating a separate account, but with all these changes going through the mid-year adjustment and stuff, actually I found out after the mid-year adjustments, but that is not an issue. We can create a separate account and put 50,000 in there. But of course, going forward, we would need a direction, how much should we put towards that reserve, so that way we can have some money on the side for any extraordinary events.
Well, I understand what you're saying there. I'm just saying that.
Right. So that message was not delivered.
Okay,
I mean,
all right,
John
well,
was there,
we can
Terry
point
was
fingers
there.
all day long at that, I don't
Right.
care, I just want to know that it's there. Okay.
Yeah, I love the $500,000 set aside. We've been in violation of our own policies of the 20% set aside, so I think that's a good step in the right direction. But I'd be willing to give on that a little bit so we can get our parks up to snuff. However, privatization or more money for public works, wherever we need, but I'd be willing to look at that, because our parks are not a desirable place for kids right now.
Okay, well, depending on what the direction is from the council, we can put together some alternative plans. But one thing that complicates the parks situation is that we're using our 2 full-time regularly salaried personnel to deal with landscape and lighting to the various districts, and we only spent $40,000 a year on the actual parks, if you want to call it maintenance. It's part-time people. All they do is run a mower over the grassy areas. So my point is that those 2 full-time employees are being paid fully out of those districts. So ideally, we'd be able to move those 2 full-time employees along with those other part-time people to deal with the parks, but then we've got, how are we going to deal with the district? And now you've got a general fund impact of probably, close to 200,000. So, but anyway, there are different ways to do it. There's a person in the room here who represents, we're not going to put her on the spot, but what's the name of the program?
It's Kingsview Work
Kingsview,
Experience Center.
Yeah, and so those are the kinds of options to consider. because Kingsview has a very good reputation, they have their own equipment. They literally can, you can literally say, show up next week, they'll come with staff, equipment, city's all out of the picture. But there are employee implications, employee contract or labor implications, so. But yes, there are options, and one of the solutions might be engaging Kingsview or something similar. So.
Okay.
So that's one more that we'll add to our list of activities. So anyway, I might be premature because to get into this, but I really appreciate how LaQuinder formulated this, because it's instead of it being information, it's actually a tool. So thank you for doing that.
I think what'll be nice too at that next meeting, if we can take that chart and actually up here in the live sense, right? As you're going through, we can actually start plugging in the numbers live and seeing when things move. So if you add here, you got to take away here. And I think the goal, I hope the goal for everyone is to establish a balanced budget that allocates adequate reserves and pays down the debt. And they have to do all those things at the same time.
So if we made all these hard choices, we could potentially have a net reduction and balance the budget with the elimination of furloughs and get the employees their 2% pay increase.
Yeah, provided we're able to implement these privatizations as quickly as we anticipate. And if you were to leave that solely to staff, I don't think we can make a promise and meet that promise. But with outside support, I think there's a very good chance, unless you would like to contradict me.
I'm only going to contradict you slightly. I think that it is not realistic to think that you're going to get all those things done in the first year. If it was me, I would suggest that you put off furloughs or the reduction of furloughs for at least one budget cycle, and see how it goes. And even if it's a matter of, you get 1% for a COLA raise and then 1%, but I think you're going to need to stagger them. And I think a lot of it's going to depend, frankly, on whether or not the marijuana ordinance comes in at all. It may be a short-term, long-term kind of thing, but I don't want to see you take on more debt until you've figured out a way to pay for what you got. And I say that with all love for staff, because I know that they've worked really hard, but if you can't sustain it, you're just going to wind up taking it away again, and that's not good.
We're at the point right now, we're getting short on time, and I would like to know, is there people within the audience that would like to make any comments?
Yes.
Okay, we need to get to that, so,
I think we're good.
okay?
Yeah.
Mayor, to gauge time, maybe, could we just get a raise of hands of anyone who's planning on speaking? So we know how to gauge time? Okay, so just one.
Okay. We'll start out at 3, but not exceed 5, how's that?
Okay. All right, well, it's me again. Mary McWaters, AFSCME Local 2703. I'm business agent that represents the employees for miscellaneous members and clerical. We also have men managers. I made some notes, and I know I'm not going to be able to read this, but once again, we're seeking to bail the city out on the backs of the employees. One thing that is conveniently left out of this is how many jobs are we talking? How many people are we going to affect, their lives, their homes, their families? That's not said in here. How many people are you going to let go? I know you try to keep the personal issues out of this, and it's all about money, but it's really not. These people have kept the city going all this time with less money, 10% pay cut. They've been loyal, and now all we can talk about is how we're going to privatize everything. Privatization is not always the answer. When you subcontract out, you end up getting, sometimes your services are substandard. The public may not be happy with what you're getting. You may get stuck with what you're getting. You're talking about the parks, okay? I know that it was said that it's not a reason to bring people here and that sort of thing, but we got homes that you want to sell here. people come here, they wanna know that their kids can be involved in services. I live here too. My kids played volleyball, they played softball, they were in the after-school program, everything I signed up right down here, right in this little office here. So what's gonna happen then? Your parks are gonna look like crap. People aren't gonna wanna live here, they're not gonna wanna have their kids aren't gonna be able to be in programs. Basically, I wanna know how many people this is gonna affect, how many employees this is gonna affect. Are you even gonna have a city left? The only thing that sounds like to me is we're gonna have this police department, which is all people are caring about right now, and that's not the answer. I mean, the police department can't function without a lot of the employees we have. You need people to fix their cars, there's a lot of stuff we need here. I understand what we're trying to do here, but there's a bigger picture here. There's a bigger picture, and we need to take a look at it. I also would like to request a copy of whatever the council got with the numbers. I didn't get any of that. I would like to have that. I would like to have a little more information on how many people that this is affecting. As a union, we're entitled to that. I will be involved in every step of the way that I'm able to. I think that's all. Let me look at my notes.
Okay.
Well, I'm sure I have a lot more, but for now, that's good.
Is there anyone else? Okay.
Well, I just want to comment that as this process moves forward, we will stay in close touch with the labor representatives. And actually, I think we could give the potential number of employees affected now, but I'm reluctant to do that because we might end up with hybrids. We don't know just yet. That's why we have to come back to the council with these concepts actually played out with true dollars and cents and projected service implications, whether it's going to improve, decrease, et cetera. And we are putting a lot of emphasis on new revenues, increasing revenues or capturing revenues that have been entirely missed. Just like, it's a small example, but the fire marshal inspection services, we just started that. That was an area that we could have been capturing over the long term. And so, we're already aggressively looking at everything possible. But I think that you ought to be meeting with me. It would have been premature to say, hey, let's get together right now, because I needed to see and feel what the council has in mind. Now we have some direction. Now we can start talking in terms of actual, some details and true impact kinds of things. So I'm happy to, in fact, I think it's my obligation to meet with you. And we will do that, and you'll have access to you'll have access to whomever you need to talk to, but specifically the two deputy city managers and me. So we'll keep you informed of all upcoming meetings. If we have staff meetings that would feature a role for your presence, and I'm not saying that we would be the sole determinants of that. If basically every meeting that we schedule in connection with this, we'll let you know, and then we'll talk about whether or not it's appropriate for you to attend. But typically, I think it would be appropriate for you to attend. So that's a commitment I think we need to maintain. So.
Okay. I think a lot of everything was accomplished here today. A very good discussion. Thank you very much, Kendall, for your insight. Doug, thank you as well.
I just want to make a comment that the gravity of this is like nothing this city's ever been through. This is an austerity measure. We're facing things that this city's never even dreamed of or fathomed of. Through this process, staff's found $7.75 million in OBED liability that we got to pay our retirees. So the current employees that are going to retire, that's important to you guys too to be thinking about as this city's moving forward, that we're meeting our obligations that once you guys get to retire. So these aren't just a quick cut or anything else, but it's for the people that have worked here for 20, 30 years, that we make sure that we take care of them and we meet our obligations that they signed on for all these years. And also the $30 million unfunded CalPERS that is being shoved down our throat because they became a political organization that doesn't want to maximize their investments, but they want to be political. And there's a big movement right now with the unions and other agencies to force CalPERS to get back in the business what they're supposed to do about making money for our employees. And what's causing this problem with these 222 other cities that are in the same mess that we're in California. But we're forced against the wall in this. So $10 million with the debt and the OBDE, the $30 million of CalPERS, that's 6 years of just millions and millions of dollars that we don't have. So, when I was talking about $5,000 here, $5,000 there, that adds up, and that's what got us to where we're at, is we didn't capitalize on every little thing that we do, and it's not gonna be popular, and Mary's right, that, it's gonna affect people, but as Kendall said, we don't have a city, then our retirees lose, everybody loses, everything we did is up in smoke, so this is not gonna be getting any funner for us. So I appreciate the public's input and you guys being here, and please realize we're taking this extremely serious.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to kind of add on to some of that too. A lot of what we discussed today has been discussed in 3 other sessions prior. We put them all up on the wall, we picked some priorities, we just never got to this step. So, and then there's a lot of new information, like Paul said, there's a lot of new information that we got today too, but a lot of these things that we discussed today, we have talked about before as being priorities. But we've taken that another step towards actually working closer to making decisions and actually taking those steps to try to look at them and see what we can do. And I think it's really good that we did it, so.
Real quick, I have a question for the city manager. What, in your time here, since you've been digging and, with Lori and LaQuinder, what got us to this point, to where we're at right now, financial crisis that could ultimately get rid of our city, if we don't take action?
Well, I don't think that any prior city council or any prior city manager intentionally made decisions that, put us in this position. But I do think there were many unknowns. This PERS situation, while it has been known for a while, actually became more critical in the recent past. So that changed the dynamics. But like I said when I was standing up there, I think that I think there was some missing information. Like probably if you had known about the OPEDs, that might have generated a stronger reaction from staff and from the council. And I also think that the budgets were viewed more like, how are we going to get through this next budget? Not so much, what's the next 4 or 5 years looking like? But so you could say, oh, this staff was really smart this time because they figured out we'd have to look at it in a 4-year context. But I think we were actually forced. We had no choice because of that 800,000, what is it, 868 or, hit coming from CalPERS. So we couldn't just look at this year because if I'm not here, which is likely, I don't want to read in the paper that this city went under because I was part of a major omission like that. So anyway, I could go on. I just think it's really important to focus on what can we do. We already know what we can do. And as Councilmember Vigneault has pointed out, maybe there's even some more, which might surface as we continue on with these things. But we just need to move forward and basically kick some butt and take care of business.
Good. Okay. If there's no other comments from anybody, thank you all very much for attending today. Meeting is adjourned.